Frank. We really appreciate, I think that the timing is a little bit difficult because I'm in New Zealand and some people are in Singapore, some people are in New York. And the timing is also quite difficult for people who are listening in, frankly, because we have all these different uh, jurisdictions that we're dealing in. But I think that the subject matter will be very interesting because of the different cultures and different business environments we're all at. Can everybody hear me? I think you can hear me, right? Hear me well? Okay, good. So, a little bit of a summary. The intersection of AI and music is a focal point, and there's a sort of an ongoing battle between copyright owners and technologists. Um, Obviously, AI is at the front line of new technology today. It was blockchain maybe last year, and a couple of other technologies a few years before. But in the middle of the struggle lies the tension between free access to data, which is AI's fundamental requirement. With data, AI develops its intelligence, right? So AI develops all the models. It develops sort of a way to understand language, for example, or a way to understand, in this case, music. AI models also, create sort of from data creates a way to understand and create designs, pictures, and all kinds of things that people are really using now. So large companies like Google have lots and lots of data, right? And obviously they are sensitive to AI companies coming in and using this data without permission. Similarly, the music environment is concerned, or rather, they are concerned that AI companies come in and basically usurp copyrighted works. So they argue that their content is inherently protected and should not be used without proper licensing. This perspective underscores a fundamental conflict that, while AI technologies thrive on access to large data sets, copyright holders seek to maintain control. Whether copyright owners are right or wrong, whether they represent actual musicians, is also part of the contention. The debate often oversimplifies the myriad interests involved, overlooking the distinct positions of creators, distributors, and technologists. In the music industry in particular, current business models appear skewed against creators. So we can discuss that a little bit more. Some people might agree, some people might not. Record labels and streaming platforms, which act as intermediaries, tend to capture a significant portion of the revenue. Anyway, the future economics of the music industry, driven by AI, might not align with the best interests of creators. It may or may not, and we can discuss this. As AI-generated music becomes more prevalent, there's a risk that unique value of human creativity and artistic freedom could be undermined. I also want to throw one more thing into the loop. Can AI systems actually create music that's good enough, that's human enough, that's attractive enough, that is the type of music we as, you know, human beings create? I personally, I argue no, because, AI music is attractive, but human beings are idiotic. They make mistakes. They wake up the next one side of the bed one day and they might come up with a tune that day and may not be doing that the next day. So we are less logical than systems. I don't know if that makes any of the argument here, but I think there's something to be said about people beings who are basically not systems. Um, anyway, so let me finish up. Can we find fairness in all of this? And I want your views. I start with Bill Rosenblatt. Maybe a short introduction and then your slides, please.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Isa, for inviting me to come on. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm especially excited to hear all the other perspectives, particularly from places on the other side of the world from where I am. I'm in New York City, USA, and I do have some slides which I'll bring up. And here we are. So Isa asked me to tee up some of the issues here that we're going to be talking about regarding music and AI, particularly generative AI, although that's not the only kind of AI that's relevant in the music industry, as future speakers will tell you about, and some of the impacts on policy, as in public policy, that we're dealing with right now. So just a little bit about myself, my background. I'm a consultant. I run a consulting firm called Giant Steps Media Technology Strategies. We have clients that range from startups in music and digital media technology and copyright related areas, all the way up through major record labels and major music service providers, companies like Spotify, Warner Music Group, Sony Music, etc. I have a sort of a mongrel background. I was trained as a software engineer. I've worked as an IT executive in the media industry. I've worked as a market strategy person in the tech industry. I've also been a radio producer, and I'm a musician. I play guitar. I teach in the music business program along with Howie Singer, who will be speaking later. He and I teach together at NYU in the music business program, and we're also the co-authors of a book called Key Changes, the 10 Times Technology Transformed the Music Industry, which was published about a year ago. And our book actually deals with AI among technologies that go back to the phonograph record and radio and CDs and tapes and things like that. I also wrote a white paper or a guide, I suppose you could call it, for WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, last year called, or actually earlier this year, called The Global Digital Music Landscape, an overview of distribution, copyright, and rights administration for music in the digital age. And that's geared toward mostly developing countries without much in the way of infrastructure for dealing with the digital music that we have today. I also run an annual conference called Copyright and Technology, which takes place every September here in New York. And I work as an expert witness in litigations, mostly copyright and patent litigations that have to do with technologies that relate to copyright and digital media, digital music. So with that, here's a little background. And I understand that I have 20 minutes, and I'm going to keep it to that because I want to hear what everyone else has to say. So the first thing to consider when we talk about AI and music is, well, what is AI? And AI is kind of a fuzzy term. It sort of means something different every 6 months. And I studied AI when I was a grad student back in the late 1980s, when it meant a whole bunch of things that it doesn't mean today, and vice versa. AI started as a field in the 1950s, and Alan Turing, the great British code breaker and mathematician, created something called the Turing test, which was essentially a test to see if an AI could fool a human being. It started out as a text-based test, but you can imagine it applying to spoken voice and video and whatever other media you care to think of. It's still very much valid today. Can AI fool a human? That's what Isa was just talking about. In 1958, the first device called a perceptron, which I'll talk about in a minute, was created. And this is the sort of fundamental invention that led to today's generative AI techniques, also known as an artificial neural network. This launched the field of machine learning, or ML, which was developed mostly in research labs, also in industry for the ensuing decades. And by the time I was in grad school, it was considered to be a dead field. It was considered to be tapped out. All of the results were achieved. There was nothing really more to do in that field. And in AI, we studied other things: expert systems, decision trees, knowledge representation. There are a whole bunch of other buzzwords. But fast forward to the 2000s, and the machine learning field was revived because people discovered that, researchers discovered that you could get sufficient computing power from networked PCs and cheap memory to make some of the things that were considered impossible back in the 80s and 90s possible. And so there was a surge in machine learning research and development. And in the late 2010s, we started to see the term AI as a sort of rebranding of machine learning, or certain types of machine learning. Then if we fast forward to the year 2020, that was when large language models were really developed, specifically GPT-3 from OpenAI. And that led to the ChatGPT application that everyone's heard of, that was launched 2 years ago. That's a chatbot based on GPT-3. So what's a neural net? Well, it's a at first it was a hardware device and now it's implemented in software, but it's this multi-layer thing that emulates the way the human brain works. It's got neurons, it's got synapses that connect the neurons. And this is the example that I use in the class that I teach at NYU. Let's say you want to have an artificial neural network to determine the price of a house based on factors such as how big is it in square feet, how many bedrooms does it have, how far away from the center of the city is it, how old is it, and whatever other factors you might define. And there's a relationship between those inputs and some intermediary steps that are taken and the output, which is the price of the house. On the right here there was a guy named Frank Rosenblatt at Cornell who is no relation to me. He was a psychology researcher at Cornell, and he created this device, which is about the size of a large refrigerator, that did this. And the way these things work is what we call supervised learning. So an artificial network is given training data, and what that is it's a set of inputs and their known outputs. So in real estate, it would be, here's a bunch of data about houses that sold. Here's how many rooms they had. Here's how big they were. Here's how many bedrooms, bathrooms. Here's how far from the city they were, et cetera, how old they were, whether they have central air conditioning, et cetera, and how much they sold for. And if you have enough training data, there's a process known as backpropagation where the various weightings of these factors get adjusted. And with enough training data, you can have a real estate model that will do a pretty good job in predicting the sale price of a house. So think about how you can use that same model to create outputs such as text or images or music or video. It's the same process. It just requires an enormous amount of training data. So generative AI is a set of techniques that are based on neural networks, plus a bunch of other techniques that we don't have time to get into. But it's essentially a model that's based on the statistical assessment of what's the next word or note or image to come out in a thing that's being generated, with some randomness injected for variability of output, so you don't get the same output all the time, every time. These neural networks are enormous. GPT 3.5 was trained on 175 billion parameters, or rather, the model consists of 175 billion parameters, and it was trained on 400 billion input tokens, which are units of language. GPT-4, which is the latest version, has 1.5 trillion parameters, and it was trained on 13 trillion tokens. So that just gives you an idea. And there's a relatively recent technique that's been brought to bear on these models called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, which basically means that the model is not limited to what's in there from training data. It can also go out and consider new sources in generating its output, and it can identify those sources so that it can say, here's where I got this information. And so if you look at, for example, Perplexity, which is an AI-based search engine, it will tell you, here's your result and here's where I got this information. You can click on the link and see what it's using as a source. So AI in music is not new, not at all. Here are just some few little highlights of the history of AI in music. Generally, 1956 is considered the first experiment that was done to generate machine-generated music. A professor at the University of Illinois named LeJaron Hiller created this thing that he called Iliac Suite. In 1995, David Bowie was known to be experimenting with something called the verbicizer, which was a lyric writing assistant, such as you might use ChatGPT for now. In 1997, David Cope, professor, composer at UC Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz, created something called EMI, spelled E-M-I, not the record label or former record label, but that was just his name. And you could feed it information, you could train it on a composer's style, and then it would create something in the style of that composer. And the first composer he used to do this was Bach, and then it was done for other composers. Then in 2002, there's a research lab of Sony in Paris, and this man, François Pachet, created something called the continuator, And if you play, like you play piano or play keyboard, it will figure out what your style is and sort of continue in that same style. So it's called the continuator. And then in 2010, Gustavo Diaz Jerez at the University of Malaga in Spain created something called Yamos, which is an AI machine that composes in its own original style. So all of this is to say that AI in music is not new. It didn't start with ChatGPT. And as you'll hear from others later today, this evening, this morning, wherever you are, you'll hear about other technologies that have been developed. And it's also important to mention that AI is not just the music generation aspect or application. There's a lot of applications that are or have claimed to be AI, and that's part of the difficulty. The definition of AI changes constantly. What is AI today? What's considered to be AI today may not be considered to be AI 6 months from now or tomorrow, and vice versa. So there are lots of applications, and you'll hear about some of them today: production and mastering, stem splitting, the carving up of recorded music tracks into stems, such as instrumental parts or vocal parts, using these techniques for recommending music, using it for generating metadata that describes music, using it for A&R, such as identifying artists that you should sign because they are about to break out. So there's a bunch of applications, and the definition of AI changes a lot, which does not help with law and policy implications, as I will now discuss. So law and policy, the way I like to think of it, and I have been involved in public policy initiatives here in the US as well as in Korea and in parts of Europe and Canada. Public policy is a multi-front war that you can think of as being waged by, in this case, music companies, record labels, music publishers, and so on. And it's got a bunch of different fronts. One of them is litigation, where you sue under existing law to get courts to establish precedents, such as what's copyright infringement and what's not, what we call fair use here in the US, what's called fair dealing in some other parts of the world. There's legislation, and Frank is going to talk more about this, so I'll just touch lightly on it. Legislation is lobbying legislators to change the laws or add new laws instead of working within existing laws. More and more public policy work is being done to the public to get the public influenced to perhaps pressure politicians to go one way or another, pressure regulators to go one way or another. There's been a lot of lobbying of public sentiment in the age of the internet, where it's easy to lobby, or relatively easy to appeal to the public in that way. Of course, there's technology, where if you want to curb or regulate some behavior, one way to do it is through technology, such as a technology to detect AI-created music or attempt to do that. And then there's the marketplace, which is where there are solutions that could influence regulation. So, for example, if you need to show that it's easy to license copyrighted material for AI, then it helps to have a marketplace solution that provides easy, convenient, and reasonably priced licensing. So I keep coming back to this idea that we've seen this movie before. One example of which is the file sharing era of the 2000s in the wake of the Napster era of the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I've made this little chart here that shows the strong parallels between the file sharing era and the generative AI era today. So we had litigation in the early 2000s and late 90s. We had Napster, which is very well known. There's a bunch of other ones, Groove Shark, Grokster, which is a case that went to the Supreme Court in 2005. The Viacom versus YouTube litigation in around 2007, which was about a user-generated content site's obligation to observe whether people are uploading copyrighted material. BMG versus Cox was about internet service providers' responsibilities. I was involved in one of those cases myself. With generative AI today, of course, we have litigations against some of the generative AI companies that are brought by record labels and by music publishers. There have been various attempts to bring legislation to address the file sharing issue. The ones that are in green are the ones that actually passed. The ones that are in red are the ones that failed. So we had a lot of attempts to create legislation in the United States to address file sharing, and the only one that passed was something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which, well, it does a bunch of things, but it lays out the responsibilities that service providers have and the ways that they can escape copyright liability if they take certain steps to address copyrighted material in their networks or on their sites. Today, we have something called the Elvis Act, which has to do with online fakes. And we have some other potential legislation that's making its way through the US Congress right now. PR campaigns. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Home Taping is Killing Music campaign, which was in the 70s and 80s in the UK. And that was all about home taping on cassette. And then there was the You Wouldn't Steal a Car, so why would you pirate movies campaign, which I think came out of Hollywood maybe 20 years ago or so. And then on the other side of the coin, the tech industry says you can't pass this legislation, it'll break the internet. We want permissionless innovation. We need to be able to innovate without having to ask permission. Today, we don't have too many of these PR campaigns yet, but one phrase that has been used in various places is a phrase from the Authors Guild, which is the US Book Authors Trade Association, which I'm a member of, called consent, credit, and compensation. That's what authors should get with AI. That's what they say they should get: consent, credit, and compensation. So it's the 3 C's. On the technology front, we all remember digital rights management, or DRM, which we still have today, although not for music downloads, but for all kinds of other things we have it. And then there are 2 other technologies that came up during the file sharing era. One is content recognition, also known as fingerprinting, which has to do with examining content and looking it up in the database to see if you recognize it as a copyrighted work. And then there's something called watermarking or content identification, where there is some information about the content that's embedded into the content itself, which tells you something about that content. You can just sort of read it through a piece of software that reads it. Today, we have some of the same technologies that are attempting to be brought to bear on this issue of generative AI. Deepfake detection is being sort of repurposed for use to detect AI-generated content. Fingerprinting and watermarking are also being investigated as part of the solution. And then there's a standards initiative called the C2PA, which I'm blanking on what it stands for. Maybe one of the other speakers remembers what it stands for, but it's basically a standards initiative to
content provenance and authenticity.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Isa. So it's a standards initiative spearheaded by companies like Microsoft and Adobe to create standards for fingerprints and watermarks and other ways that you can identify and track AI or human-generated content through its life cycle. And then in the marketplace during the file sharing era, out of that era came marketplace products or offerings such as iTunes from Apple. Rhapsody was the first major label licensed interactive streaming service, predated Spotify by several years. Pandora was an important internet radio service that you could customize to your tastes. Spotify, of course, we all know about. They launched around 2008. So there are a lot of marketplace-based solutions to this file sharing issue. Generative AI, we're in very early days. There's something called Fairly Trained. Guy named Ed Newton-Rex runs this organization that will give you sort of a seal of approval as to whether your AI has been trained on licensed material or not. And then in music, there is a startup called GCX, the Global Content Exchange, which is offering a blanket license to a very large body of music. It's mostly production music created by individual musicians. It's not, major label. It's not Beyonce or Taylor Swift. It's production music. And you can take a sort of one-stop license, what we call a blanket license to that content. So that is the first stirring, so to speak, of a marketplace-based solution. And you'll probably hear about their various AI music startups that have earned the Fairly Trained certification and that offer licensed content, if that is indeed the way the marketplace goes. So with that, oh, one more slide. The last thing I want to say is this legal part of the process, the legal fronts in the war, so to speak, will take quite a while. We're in very early days. I'd say we're in maybe the second or possibly the third year, but very early on. Of course, the US is the most litigious place on earth, so everyone looks to the US to see what's happening with our lawsuits, at least. And you can see this chart that I put together, which is taken from information in the book that Howie Singer and I wrote about how long it took to address some of these disruptive technologies that came up in the music industry. So the first mechanical reproductions of music came in the form of piano rolls in the late 19th century, and it took 26 years until mechanical reproductions were designated to be copyrightable material. 1909 is when that happened. Phonographs, sound recordings, did not get copyrights for 84 years in the US. And even then, they didn't get full copyright rights, but some of them. Radio, we are in the US one of a very small number of countries in the world that does not pay record labels or artists for broadcast radio airplay. We pay for digital radio, but not broadcast radio. And there have been many attempts to remedy that in US law. This is a list of some of those attempts through the years. None of them have succeeded. And I personally don't think that will ever change. And we can talk about that later if anyone really wants to. But this is a US specific thing. It's sort of a quirk of the US. The home taping issue, taping things at home, audio or video, got resolved with this Supreme Court case, Sony versus Universal, after a period of 30 years since the technology was first introduced. Digital file sharing, we could say, took 11 years. That was the fast one until the last peer-to-peer file sharing network was shut down. And then the issue with YouTube, user-uploaded content, was not really addressed in US law, but it was addressed, or at least attempted to be addressed, in the European Union with something called the EU Copyright Directive of 2019, Article 17. And the jury is still out, both metaphorically and really, on whether that law is effective in addressing that issue. With generative AI, we can say that the industry dates back to 2017, which is when a startup called Amper Music launched. And we'll see how that plays out, but it's going to be a while. And with that, I will stop. I'm not going to, I had some slides in case I had time left over, which I won't get to, but thank you for your attention. I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very, very much. Okay, we have a small enough group. I mean, if there's any burning, like seriously burning questions somebody really needs to ask, do you want to step up? Anybody? That quick one.
I have a quick one.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if it's a quick one. Maybe it's something we can talk about later too. But I think, first of all, thank you. And I love that. I'm one of the people who worked on the PR campaigns, stealing a movie, all of that with Frank and the gang 20 years ago in Hollywood. And I think the question that comes to my mind when I saw your beautiful history there is, and I've been asking myself this too in recent months, what is going on right now in terms of the fervor around AI? When you actually look, is it just a misunderstanding of how long it's been around, or is something fundamentally changing in terms of the way that people are embracing it? That now it's really the first thing on the corporate agenda is almost every conversation that I have across multiple industries.
Well, I have an answer to that, and I'd love to hear other answers. My simple answer to that is ChatGPT could be used by anybody. That's what changed. You don't need any skill, no training. You don't even need, you certainly don't need to know how it works or how the technology works. Unlike blockchain, where it was this mystical incantation that you needed years of training to actually know what was going on. It was just this magical blockchain thing that did something or other. But everyone is an expert because they can use ChatGPT.
Okay.
That's what I think was the tipping point.
Okay, so can we move on to Dr. Howie Singer? Can you please take the streaming stage?
Sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Bill and I, it's only appropriate we start out together because we're kind of like a tag team on these issues. So a brief introduction. You can see all the details about my background at that Linktree link, but I was the chief technologist for the strategy group at Warner Music for 15 years. And since leaving there, I've been teaching at NYU. I teach data analytics in the music industry to graduate students. Bill teaches the undergraduate version. And in fact, tomorrow's lecture is about AI. So I'm preparing for tomorrow's class by doing this tonight. In addition, I do consulting work to companies that are engaged in AI or worried about AI. I'm a consultant to the Recording Industry Association of America on generative AI issues, and a member of the advisory board of BeatDAP, which is a Canadian startup that builds machine learning models to identify fraudulent streams. So this is the money grab of fraudsters to boost. Mostly it's, although there is claims by one artist against another this week that this is being done to malign other artists, but it's typically a financial scheme to grab a piece of the royalty pool in streaming because of the way royalties are calculated. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how AI is used across the labels and companies. I have a lot of links in this talk. I'm not going to play all these examples. We'd be here all night, though, depending on how I do on time, I may use one such example. So it is the case, and Bill covered a few of these already, that AI models are already used broadly across the music industry. The predictive models that the A&R teams use to determine which artist to sign are looking at a variety of signals: streaming activity, Instagram followers, TikTok videos that are made by individual fans. All of these signals, just as Bill described for deciding what the price would be for a home, go into predicting the future success of an artist. Is that the only thing that's used to sign the artist? No, they'll still go see whether the artist, can engage an audience in a live performance. However, artists typically do not get signed anymore without the question being asked, what do the numbers say? And those numbers not only say whether the artist should be signed, it also talks about what the financial framework should the deal that's going to be signed. What should it look like? Every one of the streaming services is using that engagement data to create playlists that's based on your listening habits and what other people who have tastes similar to yours are listening to, and how much new stuff you like to listen to, right? If they give you Discover Weekly on Spotify as one example, and you never like the more esoteric stuff they suggested, guess what? You'll get more of the stuff that you like and have always liked, and they'll be less adventurous with you. If you're a person that likes the new stuff, you'll see more new stuff. So this is all based on the models that can predict whether you will stay engaged with this music and listen all the way through. There are startups that are creating radio-like services, including the voice of the DJ, to power a lean back experience, to level set the volume, which often goes up and down as you listen to a streaming service. So they'll fix those things. They'll put in interstitial ads into that to make more of a lean back radio experience that's better and can earn more advertising dollars. They are doing song analysis to recommend catalog tracks to recording artists. So if you're trying to flesh out a new album and you want to find a song that, has certain characteristics in terms of beats per minute and key and instrumentation, you can get that suggested. Similarly, advertising companies are writing briefs that are then fed through AI to find music for sync opportunities. And one of the issues that's always faced the industry is that metadata is messy and incomplete, and people are building AI models to improve that and therefore pay royalties more accurately. I should add one thing. This didn't even make it into my slides because I saw the news story this afternoon on this issue of song analysis. Spotify just closed off its API to access certain song characteristics. And the reason that people are hypothesizing they did that was to prevent AI models from scraping data about songs in the Spotify catalog of, 100 million tracks. So I don't know whether that's true or not, but, these issues are current. As Marta said, this is all she hears about. It's all I hear about as well. And it's the subject of lots and lots of discussions across the industry. So that's sort of the processes that don't touch the music, and there are more of them. But when we get into the music itself, those are starting to be affected and have processes using AI models. We are mastering the tracks for distribution using AI models. If you have the budget to go pay, a Bob Ludwig, who's one of the great masters of mastering, you will still go do that if you're the Rolling Stones or Paul McCartney or Elton John. But if you're an emerging artist, if you're just getting started and you don't know how to master your music, you can use a program like Lander to do that for you. And it's just, again, if you think about it, if you have lots of data about songs that have been mastered, you can start to identify the changes that mastering engineers make and build predictive models that will feature that and make it easier. Separating songs into stems. In many cases, the major labels, particularly more recently, have in their archives all the stems that went into a song, the drum parts, the bass part, the vocals, etc. But in some cases, they don't. And so they can use these tools to separate the songs into stems. It is also the thing that makes YouTube such a valuable source of training data for models, because you can take a YouTube video, take the audio, use one of these tools like Audio Shake, for example, to separate that audio into its component parts, which then can serve as training for other models. You could change the instrumentation. This will allow in the future to have much more personalized playlists. So, for example, suppose I really prefer steel guitar to a Les Paul. I could change that in the song and get a version that's just for me. The example I always like to use is that it was a skit on Saturday Night Live, a risky reference given this international audience, but there was a skit where they kept saying they needed more cowbell in the song. Well, we're going to be able to make songs with more cowbell if that's what you like to have. Changing the genre. One of the things that we've seen that helps in the streaming economy is that artists go in the studio and re-record remixes and variations on a theme. Justin Bieber will go into the studio with an artist who's, a top performer in the Latin music genre and create a Latinized version or add a rap verse to a pop song. Well, you won't have to necessarily go back in the studio for everybody. AI will be able to shift the genres of these songs. It was part of the list of features in NVIDIA's newest AI model introduced last week called Argato. So these things are coming. You can change the language of the performing artist. So if I'm doing a worldwide release of a song and I want Billie Eilish to sing in Japanese and in German and French, I can make a version of that track in her voice for all those markets and release it simultaneously. One example is that Brenda Lee's Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree is now available in Spanish, sung by a model that is Brenda Lee's voice. You can go watch the YouTube video at your leisure. And if you think about the way the streaming economy works, why not create lots of these and put them up on the service? Bill was but ran out of time to talk about the glut of content that's coming, even greater than what we have today because of AI. But if you're interested in generating ears and people who want to listen to that new Justin Bieber song, why not make a reggaeton flavored version and a trap version and a New Jack City version and put them all up on the service and get them all onto playlists that might intrigue listeners who prefer that kind of music? So we are about to see all those things. It's a technology that's being used in terms of separating the sound for history, right? The Beatles Get Back special, Peter Jackson used AI to uncover the conversations between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They deliberately masked their conversations by talking while instruments were playing. Peter Jackson used AI to tease out what they were saying. And again, I've given you some links to go listen to those things. So 50 years after the conversations, we finally know what John and Paul were saying to each other. And it became part of, a historical documentary about what they created. When we start to think about creating new music as opposed to tweaking existing music, the first thing that has already occurred, and Bill alluded to this with the launch of Amper Music, which was purchased by Shutterstock, is that functional music, not really trying to create a new Taylor Swift hit or a new Beach Boys track, but somewhat lower quality that's functional, also lower in price, that you could use for an ad campaign or a low budget film or an influencer video or a podcast theme, where again, you wouldn't necessarily hire Hans Zimmer, the great, movie composer, to do your student film, but you might hire or use an AI model to do that for you. And you can pick at the 32-second mark, I have a jump scare in my horror movie, and I want the music to emphasize that. And those are the kinds of things these tools can do. And what do artists think about all this? Some of them are furious, right? Bad Bunny, one of the top artists in the world, specifically said, if you like this shitty song, leave, right? They're not in favor of it. But others are using these tools already. Imogen Heap, who has always been an artist at the forefront of using technology, has already made a filter. Interestingly enough, the AI company she was working with had already called it Jen, which is kind of ironic since she's Imogen, spelled somewhat differently. And you can use these filters to make your music more like what Imogen might do. Holly Herndon is another. You can go listen to Holly Plus, which is a voice model of Holly's voice. You can listen to it singing Jolene, the famous Dolly Parton track. And you can use these tools and credit her and make it available. And she's already has a business model that says, if this song and you put it up on Spotify and it becomes successful, here's how we're going to split the money. So this is free to use. And again, if you're interested in seeing it, there are she did a TED Talk where she demonstrated the tool live. We talked about the Beatles before, but of course, those same tools were put to use in crafting Now and Then, the song that was brought out this past year that was, quote, the final Beatles song. I'm skeptical about the word final, which is why I put it in quotes. You can watch it on YouTube. It has 80 million plays on Spotify the last time I checked. And it is the first AI-assisted song to be nominated for 2 Grammys, Best Rock Performance and Record of the Year. And one of my favorite stories about this, because of how much it gave new power to an artist who no longer had it, is Randy Travis. So Randy Travis, the iconic country singer, suffered a stroke 10 years ago. He suffers from aphasia. He cannot really speak in continuous sentences. He can utter single words. He understands everything, but his speech is greatly impaired. And he sat in the studio, that's a picture of him more as a producer than a performer, tweaking a model based on his master recordings to create a new song. The new song is called Where That Came From. It has 6 million plays on Spotify. I've given you the Spotify link. I've given you the link to the CBS News story that shows this. It's a really moving story. Here's somebody who is no longer capable of singing, but has fans who want to hear him sing. And on the lower right are the upcoming tour dates for Randy Travis and his band. The singer who created the reversed version of Where That Came From, which then was overlaid and transformed into Randy's voice, will be the lead singer on that. Randy will be doing some very minor performing, but the artists that supported him, the musicians, the entire retinue of people that made a living with Randy Travis are now able to go on tour again because this new song has helped to encourage people and create new interest in Randy's music. A few examples without permission, because all these things we've been talking about come with permission. If you want to hear Johnny Cash sing the song Barbie Girl, there's a YouTube link. Hank Williams sings Texas Hold'em. It proves that Beyonce's song is country when you hear Hank Williams' voice simulated sing it. And we've already talked about Suno and Udio being the examples of the companies that have been sued by the music companies already, and Frank will get to that in more detail soon. But the link for SoundCloud is a prompt for a Mississippi blues song about a sad AI, and it sounds vaguely like a Robert Johnson song. I wonder what was trained on. And the Udio track, which is up on X or Twitter by Neil Turkowitz, who writes about copyright issues. If you play it, I defy you not to think that that material was trained on the Beatles, because that's who it sounds like. The impacts are going to be significant. Tencent in China has already released 1,000 songs with AI vocals. One of those songs has 100 million streams, and they already have a hyper-real virtual artist that they're promoting named Lucy. So these songs, we can say they're not quite good enough, but at least this example, fans are willing to listen to these songs and like these songs. And this gets to the legal issues, and are these songs going to affect the market? If I train a song on all of Randy Travis's catalog, in this case without his permission, will it take away from the listening that might have happened legitimately to his music, therefore hurting his royalty payments? And I will stop there and see if there are any questions.
Can you guys hear this in the background?
Life is laughter, it's fantastic. You can brush my.
Can you hear that? It sounds like Johnny Cash.
It does.
Undress me everywhere.
Okay, so quick questions. We should just wait to the end to have a big bash, but if there's anybody questions, speak up now.
And a lot of these themes that go all the way back to the dawn of the recording industry and how long it takes for the laws, these are all things that sort of are the threads that Bill and I pull on at the end of our book after telling the story of the phonograph and radio and everything else. We got people in lots of countries, but I'll put the link to our book in Amazon in the US. And if you're interested in more of what you heard about AI, it's one of the chapters in the book, and more about how these themes over time recur in the industry.
All right.
Just another quick question from me, if nobody else has one. And thank you for that, Howie. Is just, even what you quickly showed in a few slides, that's quite a lot of content. I'm just curious about the tracking, like what are the bodies right now tracking this, and how is it being tracked? Because I mean, it's just exponentializing.
Right. But I think the good news is there's so much interest in this that it's not hard to set up Google alerts and be informed about everything. And there are enough music business publications that write about this regularly. I can tell you, consulting for the RIAA, that, there's a team of people across the technologists and all the music companies that are keeping tabs on all of this, and also encouraging the authorized use. I mean, Warner Music Nashville was the entity that helped Randy Travis put that project together and submit it for copyright. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if it is the first. We talked about the Beatles song getting Grammy nominations. They are attempting to get copyright registration for that song now and then, for that performance by Randy Travis's voice, because there was so much human input. It wasn't simply go do it. It was handcrafted. It was artisanal in that sense. And it wasn't, as Bill said earlier, anybody can do this, right? And that's true. But to do it the way Randy Travis did it is not quite the same thing. So it's hard to keep track of everything because so much is going on. And we're here talking about music, but if the New York Times wins its case against OpenAI for stealing, in their opinion, scraping their articles, that will have an impact on the music industry as well, right? Because in this case, unlike Napster, it isn't only music that's at risk, it's every creative source, and it's graphic artists, and it's writers in Hollywood. And so because there's so much interest, it makes it hard to keep track of all of that because there's always a new court case. I mean, I mentioned two things that were in the past week, that came up, including Spotify turning off access to their API for certain song characteristics, which was disappointing because I used that in my class, but what can you do?
Okay.
Yeah, so I'd like to chime in on that if I may for a minute. In content industry trade associations generally advise companies in those industries on how to kind of move forward, and they're constrained somewhat by antitrust laws. But in the US, at least, the media industry that is the most involved, I would say, is not music, but news/journalism. The News Media Alliance is the organization that is the equivalent of the RIAA for music or MPA for movies. And they're very active in the sort of multi-level discussions that are taking place between journalism organizations and the AI companies. The most, at least publicly known, licenses or deals that have been done. The AI companies don't like the word license, but the deals that have been done are the vast majority of them, at least of the publicly known ones, are in the news and journalism space.
Johnny Stevenson, you had a question or a point.
Yeah, just to piggyback off Howie, Johnny here. I'm co-founder of a startup in licensing and tracking and reporting and fingerprinting. I just sat down with actually the RIAA yesterday, CTO, and I can't remember the lady's name who's running it. So the RIAA just got tasked to do RFIs for every watermarking and deepfake content tech company, and they're charged for 800 different labels and 3 of the majors. So, Marta, for people that are like vetting it, the RIAA, I think, is in charge for the majority of the music industry right now, in the States at least. That's what I found out recently. And then Music Alley has gave me updates on like a lot of the AI issues. So I recommend Music Alley. I've used them just to stay up to date on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, the group that is working on those reports, and I'm cautious about what I say, but I'm part of the committee that's writing the outline for that RFI, includes the IFPI, which is the international version of the RIAA.
Yeah.
The other thing I would mention, Marta, that is, I think, a good source, although it's a membership organization, so it costs money to join, is Sherry Yu, who was a journalist at Billboard, has a group, it's a DAO, a digitally autonomous organization called Water and Music, that has sessions, that keeps track of AI stuff. They were a source for some of the material in our book, so Bill and I both respect what Sherry has done, but it does cost something to become a member of their organization.
Very much.
It's like $20 a month to get
$20
full
a month
access to the reports.
Yeah.
But they have done a really good job of sort of being a clearinghouse for a lot of this information about AI. I don't know if Bill agrees or not with me.
Howie,
well, they're very good at getting other people to do research for them and then publishing it. I'll say that.
Okay, Frank, can you please take over as the next speaker?
I'll try, Isa.
I wanted to give a little bit of flexibility so people can interject here and there. I mean, I don't think we need to be really strict that, we don't have that many people here now, so it's like there's room for a bit of flexibility. So please take over. Thank you.
Just give me a minute here, Isa. Gotta fuss with my screen.
Okay.
Not as adept as our predecessors here.
Yeah, okay. Carry on.
Is that up there?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for Isa for that introduction, and good morning from Bangkok, everybody.
Thanks for putting this together, Issa. I think it's a very timely issue, and it hits home for me because my mother was a musician, and we had a lot of music growing up in the house, and talent skips a generation. So my son is a musician too, and the two of them have spent literally thousands of hours honing their craft, performing publicly, studying it at school. So I'm the first to say God bless musicians everywhere. Our lives would be really dull and colorless without them. Only got about 20 minutes today, so I'm gonna limit my remarks to generative AI. I'm not gonna talk about the other ones. And I do have some slides, so let's get into it. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Now, all kidding aside, I kind of get where Grandpa Simpson's coming from. Because when we talk about unregulated generative artificial intelligence, if you haven't figured it out by now, I am an old man. And it's true that when I first heard about GAI, my reaction was get the hell off my lawn, you kids. Having watched my mother and my son spent literally thousands of hours honing their craft, practicing, my personal reaction is to feel insulted when I hear or read that we don't need musicians anymore, or that they may just be professions along with lawyering that just might be replaced by GI. I kind of disagree personally at a fundamental level that their skills or their creativity are now somehow irrelevant or antiquated because of a new computer tool that's been created that allows anybody to do whatever they want the musician to do. But unregulated generative AI systems are capable of destroying not only the livelihoods of music creators, but the musical culture itself and all the human progress that stemmed from it. But Bob Dylan said famously, "Don't criticize what you can't understand." And I certainly don't consider myself to be an expert like Bill and Howie are on the field. What I do want to do instead is just offer up a few observations that you can agree or disagree with about the current state of affairs that seems to surround GI. And anything I'm going to say, I don't hold out as my own. Everything I'm going to say has already been said by people who are smarter than me. Early on as a year in my career, I worked as a lawyer with the NMPA, National Music Publishers Association in New York. And one of the issues that we were grappling with back then in the early 90s was digital sampling. And the digital technology that enabled the sampling phenomenon was more than a generation ago. And it seemed to be supported by a lot of the same moral foundations and the lingo that surrounds GAI today. And it's ironic to me that some of today's music moguls and industry icons, particularly on the production side, were the young upstarts back then when we were all starting out. But here we are 30 years later, and it sounds like deja vu all over again. In other words, a lot of the justifications and the buzzwords that those young upstarts said way back when are the same things that are being said by the disruptors today. Things like it's still early days and information wants to be free and just get out of the way so we can all embrace this cool new thing that you don't understand really are the same things that were being said 30 years ago. I've heard this song before.
Content is free, Frank.
Yeah, exactly. Wants to be free. So, I think it's just kind of trite and simplistic to think that anyone is really fooled by quaint, cute little phrases like sharing music, which, let's face it, really means taking it without asking somebody, or training GI, which really means feeding it with other people's copyrighted works of their voices or their instrumentation, often without their knowledge or their permission. These phrases that I've listed here today, which I've just borrowed from an existing source, at least I credit it though, all strike me as doublespeak to really distract us from a lot of what's going on. It's hauntingly familiar to things that were said during the first internet bubble in the late 1990s, when investors were climbing over each other for reasons that they really couldn't justify.
Frank, if you're talking about another slide, we only see the first one.
Oh, sorry about that. I think I've got my wrong screen being shared. Can you see this one now?
Yes.
Yeah, you might want to try putting it in slideshow mode.
Yeah, well, you might.
It's the little screen type icon at the movie screen type icon at the bottom.
Yeah, I know. Just not as adept as you are. Hold on, guys. Lisa, this is why I want you to run all this stuff, because I'm an old man.
There we go.
Yeah, okay. So you're looking at that now.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
all
got it.
right. So these are the phrases that, again, I thought I first heard about 30 years ago when I was dealing with digital sampling. Stuff like information wants to be free. You don't understand. Just get out of the way. It's somehow your fault if you don't get it. But this little facetious business model on the right is not unlike what was going on in the first wave of dot-com fever, where investment really was based, it seems to me, on hype and pizzazz rather than on any sort of sound economic foundation or any principles. What it seems to me when it comes to unregulated GAI, trading freedoms, cultural advancement, and commercial fairness for short-term profit has become the MO for an entire class of music-related global tech conglomerates. These companies often seem to feel a higher duty to their shareholders than they do to the people whose music they use without their authorization. The company made me do it is often what their programmers will say. And this has led many people to observe, at least for the time being, therefore, that the industry can be likened to a finished roof atop a house. It's been built without a supporting foundation. Sure, there are a lot of exceptions, and some people are bound to get rich quick. But a lot of what's going on really doesn't seem to me to be grounded in economic reality. And NVIDIA might be the new Apple or the new Microsoft, but most of what's out there just seems to be today's cryptocurrency. People are certainly free to buy into it, but as they used to say during the Roman Empire, caveat emptor. Bill mentioned a lot of the litigation that's going on. I say it's built on House of Cards because a lot of GAI has been built on largely, if not exclusively, on the unauthorized use of copyrighted material. Now, this is a chart that's floating around last month that it shows the extent of infringement litigation that's already taking place in the United States. Now, admittedly, a lot of these cases don't involve music, but there's already so much litigation going on there that it's really hard to fit it all onto one screen. But the common thread among all of this seems to be that they involve creators' copyrighted materials that were allegedly infringed, meaning they were taken and used without their prior knowledge or their consent for training purposes. And, Bill mentioned that the law is often accused of being 2 or 3 steps behind technology. And it's certainly true that television and DVDs both scared the hell out of the movie industry when they were first unveiled. But both of them did go on to become enormous moneymakers for the Hollywood studios. So I'm not suggesting that we even try to put the toothpaste back into the tube and pretend that GAI was never developed. But what I am observing is that it's been a phenomenon built around moving fast and breaking things. It seems to be at the moment more about begging for forgiveness than about asking for permission. And again, some of the same things we said back in the day about digital sampling, that it was just merely a tool for transformative works that breathe new life into dead works, are being said today about GAI. But ultimately, the law always catches up, and that's like when Gilbert O'Sullivan sued Biz Markie for sampling his song Alone Again without authorization. And Judge Duffy began his decision by quoting the Bible's admonition that thou shalt not steal. Now, so far, there's been, at what first seems at first glance, a discouraging outcome from the creator's perspective to one of these litigations. But interestingly, the case didn't touch upon the substance of the infringement allegation. And this is the Raw Story case in New York that was dismissed due to insufficiencies in the plaintiff's pleadings. Now, the plaintiffs there alleged that in the course of ChatGPT's training exercise, the defendant removed the plaintiff's copyright management information from the subject works, which is itself an offense under Section 1202 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And, their Judge McMahon claimed that the plaintiffs had failed to properly establish in their complaint that Raw Story had in fact suffered an injury due to the removal of their copyright management information, which is a requirement of the particular provisions of Section 1202. So she said Raw Media lacks standing to sue under that provision. And she also said that what's really at stake here was not so much the removal of the copyright management information, but really the unauthorized use of the copyrighted material in the first place. But she simply dealt with that by saying that question is not before the court today. So she kind of questioned why they filed the complaint the way they did. And she said they're free to refile a new complaint if they wish. and Raw Media has said that they certainly intend to do so. But many of the other suits, including the ones against Udio and Anthropic, allege that intentional and widespread unauthorized reproduction of thousands of copyrighted works have taken place, and the defendant's liability, if they're found guilty, could amount to hundreds of billions of dollars in statutory damages. So this is all interesting litigation to follow, and I really don't have too much time to get into the substance of it. But while the litigants have been busy fighting each other in courts, governments around the world have been, trying to put this genie that's gotten out of the bottle around a couple of key concepts, legislative concepts. The first is whether GAI generated works should be entitled to copyright protection in the first place. And another broad framework of policy decisions is whether copyright laws should have statutory exceptions from liability infringement that allow the so-called training for GAI or any other rules that are imposed in the course of their operations. So regarding the first issue, it's generally been held up to now that copyright protects human creation. So the question becomes whether or how much human creativity is involved in GAI generated works. And by now, governments have come out with three slightly different perspectives. And as of today, right now, the view in the United States is that AI generated works are not eligible for copyright protection, whereas the view in China, by comparison, is that they most certainly are. And the United Kingdom and the European Union have gone as far as saying, well, they might be, or they could be. But really, there's no hard and fast rules yet or universally agreed principles that have emerged on that first question. The second issue is really where the action is, and I want to start by focusing on two jurisdictions that have effectively preempted the kind of litigation that we're seeing in the United States by allowing a statutory defense against so-called machine learning. Singapore amended its Copyright Act in 2021 and has probably the broadest exception for AI training purposes anywhere in the world, under what's called a text and data mining exception for computational data analysis. It does have some safeguards to it, including that the user has lawful access to the work in the first place, meaning that it hasn't been locked behind a paywall or otherwise protected by a technological protection measure. Japan actually enacted a TDM exception 3 years before Singapore did, but the wording of the exception was subject to varying degrees of interpretation, and there's an ongoing public consultation now to help clarify it. Other jurisdictions have enacted or introduced legislation that goes to what AI companies have to do to operate at all. And the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act is a regulation that assigns different categories of risk to either ban AI applications altogether, or to regulate them, or to leave them entirely alone. It's a little bit complicated. I bet we could organize an entire webinar just around examining the EU AI Act. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to lay it down as a marker for you guys to look up later. Now, in the United States, there's three separate bills that are now pending in Congress. The Content Origin Protection and Integrity from Edited and Deepfake Media, or the COPIED Act, was first introduced in the Senate this past April, and it would allow content creators to place non-removable digital watermarks on their works to differentiate between originals and deep fakes. The No Fakes Act of 2024 was introduced in July, and it seeks to protect voices and visual likenesses of all individuals from unauthorized computer-generated recreations. And finally, the Transparency and Responsibility for Artificial Intelligence Work Networks, or the TRAIN Act, was introduced in late November. And it would allow aggrieved rights owners to petition courts for an administrative subpoena so that they could determine whether or not their works have been used for so-called training without their authorization. Kind of like subpoenaing IKEA for an instruction chart on how to build your cabinet. All of these bills have been endorsed in principle by rights owners as steps in the right direction for protecting creators' rights. But none of them really go to the threshold issue of infringement that we now see being litigated in the courts. So the advocacy continues on the front, and the question remains whether or how rights owners can monetize this stuff for themselves. So, okay, back to digital sampling. What began as a take without asking means of disruption was then subject to litigation in the courts, and it finally evolved into a more ordinary practice that was built upon consent and credit and compensation that Bill mentioned at the beginning. So after the first wave of disruption finally settled through a few lawsuits, what was left in place for digital sampling was a voluntary licensing practice involving both music publishers and record companies. It was determined that compulsory licensing system for non-dramatic musical compositions under Section 115 of the Copyright Act wasn't applicable, and it had to be licensed voluntarily, subject to the copyright owner's consent. And that's largely where I think we're going to be headed today. Again, what I'm observing, not promoting for myself, is that creators' organizations around the world are uniting themselves around common themes. They recognize that GAI is probably unstoppable and probably even a tool for tomorrow's creators, but the phenomenon needs to really grow up and stop acting a bit like a kid in a candy store. Bill mentioned there's a very simple petition that's being circulated by the Authors Guild and others that states, I'm just going to read it. It calls on the CEOs of OpenAI, Alphabet, Meta, Stability AI, IBM, and Microsoft to obtain consent, credit, and fairly compensate writers for the use of their copyrighted materials in training AI. Now, the National Music Council in the United States, which is a congressionally recognized umbrella organization of American music groups advocating for the advancement of music creators and educators, made the rounds of Washington last July. And they issued what I thought was a very balanced and even-handed charter to govern the future intersection of GAI and the music industry, and I'd encourage you all to read it. That link that I put up there. But to summarize, it sets out the following foundations. One is that copyright owners must be guaranteed by U.S. and international laws the unambiguous right to control the use of their works in all Gen AI related to all generative artificial intelligence contexts related to ingestion, manipulation, and output. It also said that unlicensed ingestion, manipulation, and output fall outside the boundaries of the U.S. fair use doctrine. It also set out that legal doctrines around the world should, as a matter of universal right, be guaranteed the rights of consent, credit, and compensation. It states that a human-centric approach to all generative AI regulation favors the rights of human beings over those seeking to supplant human creation. It states that there should be disclosure that generative AI-derived works are the products of generative AI and not substantially human creations. It states that in order to qualify as being copyrightable, a musical work must have been created by human authors. It states that laws around the world should also recognize individuals' rights of publicity for the use of their names, their likeness, their voice, their instrumental sounds, or other identifiers. And it states further that the music industry should be included in the legislative process that governs generative AI regulation. And it concludes by two more points: that cooperative dialogue is amongst all interested stakeholders the best way to approach this regulation. And finally, it states that the implementation of a compulsory licensing solution with government sent royalties is not supported by them, and that licensing systems and practices should instead operate on a voluntary market basis. Now, elsewhere in the world, GEMA, which is the rights organization in Germany that licenses the reproduction and public performance of musical compositions on behalf of composers and music publishers, announced a new licensing scheme that it plans to unveil that will embrace and support the tenets of consent, credit, and compensation. We're hearing that a lot. And you can read the article about that, the Music Business Weekly, published at the end of September. So far, it's very scant on details, and it seems more like a concepts of a plan, but at least it's a start. And it should also be noted that GEMA has their own litigation going on against OpenAI for copyright infringement of its members' works. So perhaps the two are interrelated. I think we're running short on time overall here, so I'm just going to close out by paraphrasing a phrase from the late, great Hunter Thompson that he first offered about the television industry back in the 1985. But while you're reading that, I'm going to read to you guys something that my son sent me yesterday because I think it's really important. And he says, "We've already let music become so valueless as it is that AI-generated music, to me, seems just like the nail in the coffin. For me, the value of music has always been human creation connection that it can create. from the energies that can be created at a live show to the lived feelings one human can somehow communicate to another. It's the power of expression that's always been the point of music to me. To suggest that a robot can create this is, to me, as a human being, fundamentally wrong, sad, and pathetic. And as a musician and a songwriter, it's frustrating and it's frightening. Every day, I'm reminded how short and shallow attention spans already are, and how music has become more about aesthetics, trends, and marketability than the power of raw human expression. To accept AI-generated songwriting is to let the human part of music die, literally. And I haven't even touched on the financial hopelessness we songwriters feel and will continue to be doomed by should AI songwriting prevail. So I think you know my views and the views of some others. Isa, thanks very much for the kind opportunity to be part of the discussion today, and thanks to everybody for listening.
Thank you very much, Frank. All right, excellent. Does anybody have a quick question, point?
Hi, Isa. Can I raise my hand?
Yes, please.
Let's see if I can get my video on. But
Tim is an AI business entrepreneur. He's started companies about AI and cybersecurity. So carry on.
yeah, and I'm building a lot of generative AI myself. Really interesting, and I see parallels, and I just wanted to talk about some of those parallels. So you know, example, what I'm doing, but let's push it to art, which makes it easier. There's a painting just the other day created by an AI painting robot that, you know, was sold for $170,000 and was the first ever, you know, totally AI creation. The parallel I was going to draw is, you know, as an example, I'm building in the background a lot of different things. The interconnectivity, you know, and I call it augmented AI because it's not just AI. You've got to augment it with real life things. And in the example you're using with music, the power is in prompts.
Tim, sorry, can you speak louder, please? Sorry.
Yeah, I can turn my mic up to a different mic as well. Just give me 1 second, really quickly. Okay. There you go. I'll switch you on to a separate microphone.
Much better. Thank you.
Yeah. So what I'm doing is, you know, I'm building things, but the power is in the prompts, and you have a thing it's augmented AI, which basically means you're using AI, generative AI, but then you're augmenting it, combining it with traditional mediums, which is exactly the same as the example of music. So there is power in the prompts, and everybody's prompts will be different, and everybody, you know, in my space is learning about the power of different prompts and training the AI, not training the AI, but enabling the AI to get the creativity that you need by the creativity of your prompts. And it's then drawing from a very large base to, you know, push that out potentially for creativity around it. So, you know, do you see that there is anything in there which could be IP'd? You know, the power of the prompt.
To some extent, this goes back to Bill's point earlier about randomness injected. That term I wrote down on a piece of paper. You know, the power of the prompt in terms of, like, you know, is it possible to inject randomness, inject creativity? And to what extent is that actually copyrightable and, you know, creative? Anybody?
Well, I'll jump in, I guess. The way you know, there's a new job title now, prompt engineer, right?
Yeah.
You can, and so just like when I was starting out as a software engineer back in the early to mid 1980s, there was no credentialing in that field. And so there's no credentialing in prompt engineering, but one can easily imagine that there will be. And I think that, honestly, to me, the direction that this may go is that prompt engineering is going to be like using a DAW or using Photoshop or anything like that. And it'll be recognized as a skill, right? And so right now, in the US, the Copyright Office does not recognize that as a skill because it forbids any AI created content for being eligible for copyright protection. And as Frank said, that's idiosyncratic to the US. Other jurisdictions are treating it differently. But I think that this is another 10 years of litigation and controversy, because what does it mean to be AI generated? Well, it means something different every 6 months. And I can, at my conference, we've had these discussions. There's going to be a lawsuit for copyright infringement. The first thing that a defense lawyer does in copyright infringement lawsuit is to try to discredit the copyright registration, to say, you shouldn't have gotten a copyright for this in the first place, or there's something wrong with your registration, you didn't dot an I or cross a T properly. And what they're going to do is they're going to say, let's say it's an image for simplicity. Oh, this image of yours, this photo or this visual artwork, you used Photoshop, and our discovery has determined that you used a plugin to Photoshop that advertised itself as AI powered to generate, I don't know, to get rid of the pimples on somebody's face or whatever the thing does. And you shouldn't have gotten a copyright because you used an AI powered plugin. So there's going to be a lot of this. There's going to be years of this. And I feel like eventually where this inevitably has to come out is there will be some recognition of skill and creativity required to use AI in a manner sufficient to create new creative works. The licensing thing and the call it what you will, stealing, borrowing of existing copyrighted material is one issue, but this is a separate issue. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this is a skill, just like using Pro Tools is a skill, using Avid is a skill, using desktop publishing is a skill, using Photoshop is a skill. That's where I think we're headed.
But Bill, just a quick one there, right? So a skill attracts copyright, doesn't it? I mean, no, computer systems can't generate randomness, pure randomness. You cannot generate from a chip. So the person
absolutely you can. You certainly can create randomness.
Well, I mean, that's debatable. A lot of engineers will say, well, no.
Define randomness. What's randomness?
Like I said earlier, wake up in the morning on the left side of the bed and feel like feel like crap.
Well, you're talking about human qualities, which I would not equate with randomness. Randomness is something else. Randomness is a mathematical property.
Have we been able to create a chip that can create randomness or randomness? Pete, you're saying something.
We already have.
He started
50 years ago. We did that.
All right, Pete.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, you can do randomness. I mean, it's used all the time in algorithmic music and all kinds of things. The difficulty isn't creating randomness. The difficulty is creating stuff that has human elements to it. I mean, that's the tricky thing.
That's right.
Not randomness.
I thought human beings are random.
Well, again, I think come back to what Bill said. You got to define randomness. I think what you're talking about is a particular kind of filtered randomness where we behave in certain ways. There are the stimulation for that may be randomness inside our brains, but then there's all of our internal neural networks that process all of that stuff. So, I mean, it's the complexity and richness of human behavior that's hard to do in things like algorithmic music. I certainly wouldn't call that randomness. Randomness is the easiest thing in the world to do. In fact, I created algorithmic music systems where I've specifically tried not to use randomness because everybody else does it, right? For example.
Onto a philosophical discussion on what is human, right? Because I think random is only part of human, and are humans truly random is another question. Or are we all actually influenced by all the things that have gone before us in our lives? That's, I think, a whole question of neuroscience and philosophy.
And that's the interesting part, right? We come to a juncture where we are trying to philosophize and trying to figure out the interjections between systems and human beings. And then
I agree with what Bill said about prompt engineering becoming a profession. Then the profession can be regulated as to what a prompt engineer creates.
Okay.
Sure, you could do that.
These discussions seem philosophical, but they're not in one sense, right? The defense that these AI companies are making, and Frank talked about some of this, is that, and in some cases, we're losing once again the battle of the language. Machine learning was a term a long time ago, but the implication is the machine learns, as opposed to being the machine is a predictive engine based on all these other factors. But the companies, the AI companies, are making the argument that, and I've heard them make it, they've made it to me, is that this is no different than if one of my students at NYU sat in their dorm room for a month and listened to every Taylor Swift recording. And at the end of that month, they wrote a new song that was inspired, that was an homage to, that took the lessons they had learned by listening to all that Taylor Swift music and wrote something new. The machines are doing the exact same thing. I don't buy that argument. I don't believe the machines are learning the way a human being learns, but they're saying you wouldn't want to stop that student from writing a song that was inspired by Taylor Swift. Well, you shouldn't want to stop Suno or Udio from creating a new Beach Boys track after they studied every single piece of data in the entire catalog of the Beach Boys. I don't think that's the same as what a human does. This argument, this philosophical argument that the machines are doing exactly what human beings do, is going to be at the heart of some of these court cases.
Okay, can I ask you guys a question? Can you ask an AI system to write a discordant song? I can tell you, coming from like Asian
Sure.
perspective,
Absolutely.
Going to a Chinese funeral, you hear a whole bunch of discordant sounds. It don't make no sense. Can you get an AI system to write that?
Sure.
Just
Absolutely.
train it on that music, and then it'll do it, right?
And what prompt?
Define discordant.
It's out of tune. It doesn't have it's not in a major scale. It's not in a minor scale. Blues song.
I mean, I know a bunch of people who are doing stuff in the avant-garde experimental music community, which is about as far away from regular melody and beat and all the standard normal parameters of music as you can get. And absolutely, AI can do that. And in fact, it may be easier to make AI do that than to do some of the mainstream stuff.
No, you could argue that the stuff that the aleatoric music that people like Milton Babbitt were doing in the 1960s fits that description. One person's discordant is another person's harmonious. I mean, I personally don't care for it, but that's just my own personal taste.
That's right.
Yeah,
Well, I love to hear it. So far, the AI music I've heard, they just sound perfect and pristine and just so wonderful. It's just so radio friendly. It's just even too radio friendly. It's not like the type of stuff I like to listen to. Like, you go out there growing up and wherever. You listen to Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa is not like a pristine singer.
It's kind of formulaic music, isn't it?
Well, I think beyond that, where I agree with Issa is it's literally start sounding like robots. Like literally a lot of the music that I'm hearing is robotic in nature, and even the AI used in videos on Instagram or whatever, it's robotic in nature, and it's all kind of starting to become like one thing. So in that respect, I think I understand what Issa is saying. There's definitely an element where it's not sounding human.
I would say that has been the challenge in electronic music all along. I've been doing electronic music for 50 years, and the whole challenge is to get beyond it sounding robotic and mechanical, and to add the dirt, to crack the lens, to do the stuff that makes it interesting. You have to work sometimes to get the dirt in there. But I think in many ways AI will increase that, make that easier compared to traditional electronic music tools, actually.
Yeah, well, that's a really good term you're using, adding the dirt. So in a regular mix, right? You compress it. You compress a digital mix. You add the dirt. You add the distortion to it. It doesn't make another Beatles. It doesn't make audio and analog recording. It doesn't make the human being. It doesn't make the dynamics behind it. So anyway, good points. Let's move on to Benjamin, who can give us a view of technology and security and what's happening with in Singapore. Ben?
Okay, I got to say that this is kind of like the weirdest, this is probably the strangest addition to the call. So
okay,
why am I here? So glad to see all the friends here whom I know, and also to meet new people. And thanks to Isa for setting this up, because I think this is a really great discussion. And you really have some of the experts in this field here. So I'm very glad to hear from them. So this is my kind of like personal views which are based on this perspectives that I have. Tech and policy side, I'm a senior research fellow at the Center of Excellence for National Security, Future Issues and Technology, and Digital Impact
Can I
Research,
get everybody else to turn off their mics, please?
which is 3 think tanks in one institute that focus on tech and security issues and emerging tech especially. And I'm also double hatting as the co-chief data officer for AI Singapore, which funds a lot of the AI research in Singapore. On the music side, I'm the principal tutor of the Electronic Music Lab at NUS, National University of Singapore. And I'm also an independent musician. Cosmic Armchair is my band, and signed to Alpha Matrix. So I've got 2 different perspectives. My background is I was a lawyer and I was also an enterprise IT technologist. So I have those 2 backgrounds as well. So based on that and based on the people I meet, I'm going to share not so much on what the rest have shared, because that's something that you can already read, and there's a lot of very good analysis that they've given. Talking about how our students have been using AI and how they benefited from it, because let's talk about the benefits first, right? The breaking down stems has been really good for learning. So they've been able to learn a lot about how music is made by using AI tools to break down the stems of music and actually analyze the different parts so that they have a better ability to grasp what's going on in the music. AI is being used for mixing and mastering now. I think there is a problem that the people need to still learn the skills, but it's helping to get pieces of music, so we say, across the finish line to make that final piece sound better that they've already created. Idea generation, definitely coming up with fresh ideas, fresh chord progressions, fresh melodies that they can work on. Sound design, because there are new tools that are able to create sounds where there were no sounds before, and to resynthesize, recreate, a lot of very, very interesting, powerful tools. And then voice or instrument generation. So in the past couple of years, what we found is students coming up with a piece of music, and they suddenly you hear, wow, that's a great vocal. Who sang this? Right? Where did you get this vocal? In the past, they would be taking vocal samples of maybe a Creative Commons site or maybe of Splice. Now they actually can generate the entire vocal with AI when the student themselves cannot sing. They made all the music, but, well, they tell me they made all the music, but the vocal is now AI generated. But that raises a very interesting question. Is this something that we now want to have in a performance? It's one thing if you have vocal sample snippets saying things or saying certain lines, but what if the entire vocal, verse, chorus, bridge is sung by AI? So very interesting questions that raises. Now, the students that we have at the Electronic Music Lab are not necessarily going on to be full-time musicians. And this is the other part of music creation that is being tapped on, which is the non-professional musician, the non-full-time musician who is the average person who has an interest in expressing himself or herself in musical form. And we've gone through all the different examples of how there are different tools that have enabled the home user to be able to create music where they previously couldn't, whether it's from player pianos, then up to arranger keyboards that could play auto rhythms and auto chords, then sampling, then DAWs, and now as a home user, you could actually create more and more music just by putting in prompts. So if it's being used in a home use context for a person's personal expression, is it bad? Is it good? I leave that as an open question. So then we talk about the challenges for Global South, or global majority, or what used to be called developing nations. One is the lack of representation. And in a lot of the LLMs, they are being trained on mainly Western data. And this was a problem that we noted at AI Singapore, because we found that if you ask ChatGPT questions about, let's say, a Southeast Asian country, you get back a very biased answer. You get an answer that comes out of maybe New York Times content, because that's the majority of what the LLM is trained on. And apologies to all of you who faithfully follow New York Times, that's not necessarily the most accurate representation of what's actually happening on the ground in Southeast Asia. So as a result of that, AI Singapore, we actually trained a LLM on Southeast Asian content, creating what is called Sea Lion LLM, which stands for Southeast Asian Languages in One something. And that is able to give a more representative view and more representative answers of what Southeast Asian are saying. Now, then you have a question of like, wait, does it mean that New York Times is wrong? Or what are these Southeast Asian sources are maybe state-run sources? Are they then inaccurate? That's an interesting question, right? Where you have to then talk about how do you balance these competing interests. So representation is going to be a problem in music as well, because if it's all trained, and we had this very interesting discussion, can it be trained on random music, discordant music, aleatoric music, experimental music? Pete's raised some very interesting points there. And I really think that I totally agree with him, because if you train the music on whatever you train it on is what you'll spit out. So if you train it on avant-garde music, you'll create avant-garde music. Maybe not artistically of a quality that we would appreciate, or aesthetically of a quality we appreciate, but you'll be able to have a simulacrum of it. And so then the question is that, okay, so we now have a problem. If Southeast Asian artists or Asian artists are not being represented in the LLMs, should they then train LLMs? Should we train it, or should somebody train LLMs on Southeast Asian music? Then it brings us to the other flip side problem, which is who's going to protect the rights of the Southeast Asian musicians whose music is being used to train the AI, because many of them will not have the ability to protect themselves against the huge US corporations. So where is the protection of their rights? Add on to that, the next problem, the third problem, which is the lack of interest in IP generally in a lot of Southeast Asian countries and Asian countries. And this, from my experience in going to teach copyright law in CLMV countries, which I generally face with, that's nice. Copyright is a nice concept, it's a nice theory, it's a very Western theory, right? But doesn't apply to us here. So that is there a question of what does copyright mean in the Global South? Because the economic models are different. The benefits of protecting IP may not be as great. Then the third point is that, which underlies a lot of this, is there's a hegemony of Silicon Valley ideology and values. And Frank's examples there were great, because all of the things like move fast and break things, information wants to be free, are all Silicon Valley ideology. Should they be imposed on the Global South, who may not subscribe to the same ideologies, same values? Right? So this, to me, is a question of how do you know what is the ethics then of applying, training the AI or deploying the AI. So, okay, so I know you asked me to talk about risks, right? So in the research we're doing on security risks, first of all, we will say that from my legal background, a lot of this reminds me of the Xerox case, AI having dual uses, that the AI itself can be used for legitimate purposes, which I talked about in a few slides ago, and also for dangerous purposes. And in the Xerox case, it was decided that if a technology can be used for good and for bad, you cannot exclude the technology itself. You can only exclude the bad users. So I would say I have nothing against AI. I mean, I use AI myself in a lot of my writing, a lot of my music. sound design and mixing. So there's dual use. Okay, having said that, what are the risks? Deception is a big risk. Deception in the form of like the AI Drake. So right now we are in a state where, oh, we found it, we caught it. Oh, yeah, obviously it wasn't Drake on the weekend. Yes, that's fine, that's now. But there are already cases where it is becoming harder and harder to tell. Then the problem is that it might not be like trying to generate an entire song. It could be deception in the form of, because the celebrities' voices are so easily available, snippets, right? Deepfake voice. Deepfake voice is harder to spot than deepfake video because we don't have the visual cues. Especially if the sound quality is bad, then we just think, wait, maybe it's a bad recording. So deepfake voice is a very, very deceptive form of deception. And you can do a lot of things with that. You can do scams, you can do fraud, you can do a lot of disruption to society. If you get somebody to say something that is incendiary, you could get somebody to say something which is racist, homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and they never said it, but you got that snippet which sounds like a voice memo, and that can actually create a lot of disruption, unrest, death threats. So that's a deception problem. Second one is data privacy. Right now, we've got very little data privacy protection on personal data that's being scooped up and fed into the LLMs. And we're already worried about it coming out in, like, say, ChatGPT searches. If you go and put ChatGPT and you ask ChatGPT, what is your address? And you suddenly see your address coming out, or what is your bank account number? That could be very, very, very worrying. But what if it comes out in a song? What if your personal data, your password comes out in a song? Right? So this is yet another area, because the regulation of the music LLMs is being done separately from the chat LLMs. And finally, moral rights for use of music. Because it's fun when you can use Johnny Cash's voice to sing a Beyonce song. That's fine. But what if you use an artist's voice to sing something which is against their principles? Like you say, you get an artist to sing something which is, again, racist, anti-religious, Islamophobic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, whatever it is. What are the moral implications of getting an artist to sing, an artist's voice to sing that? Because that's, even if it did not infringe the copyright of that artist's previous work, it's now created something which is totally against what the artist wanted their voice to be used for. And the last slide that I have is about YouTube Content ID and other forms of code is law. There is a whole situation of YouTube Content ID now is in effect creating law, because beyond copyright law, because so long as a piece of music is entered into the YouTube Content ID database, the default will be that if you have a piece of music that is similar to that, whatever is in the Content ID database, you will get flagged for infringement. This is with totally no accounting for fair dealing, fair use, or even if the underlying part that was copied is actually public domain. This I know as a minor YouTuber, having put my own lessons from the Electronic Music Lab onto YouTube, and we just take a loop, a generic loop from Splice, and we put it, that loop itself is royalty free. It can be used. There's no claim of copyright by the creators, which is the sample pack making company. So I use it in a lesson, right? So I've got two things. I've got the royalty free sample. I'm using in a lesson, which is under fair dealing. But it goes on YouTube and it gets flagged for Content ID. Why? I checked. YouTube says that this segment has been claimed by a song, because somebody released a song where they use this loop, and there's a section of the song where the loop is playing by itself, which is musically and aesthetically terrible and should not give them the ability to lock me out, anybody else out of the use of using that loop itself. But Content ID does it because that's what the machine does. And because Content ID is automated, it is very hard to dispute this. You can submit, and there's actually a risk, if you submit your claim and your claim is struck out, then you get a strike, you get an official strike against your channel. 3 strikes and you lose your channel, which for musicians, independent musicians, content creators, can be disastrous after you've created all the content and build up all the goodwill. So you see that the law is being created in effect that it's beyond copyright law. I'm actually under copyright law, it's a royalty-free loop. I'm using it in teaching, it's fair dealing. I should be able to use it, but Content ID says, no, I can't. And so, again, all the contractual things that are being done between the companies, and the Content ID is actually a result of contractual agreement between YouTube and the labels. Content ID is great because Content ID means that if somebody used one of my band songs as a soundtrack for their, let's say, drone flyover video, I get my tiny, 0.05 cents as a royalty through my label because our songs are on Content ID. That's great. But the way that is happening now, which has no human oversight, is very dangerous because now if you've got more AI-generated music, and you've got AI-generated music that is going to be put onto Content ID, and you create something which sounds similar to it because it is now making a copy of you, you could end up having yourself, the AI version of yourself, automatically creating a copyright strike on you. If that makes any sense at all, and it doesn't. It shouldn't. You should not have a copyright claim against you. But it can because the system is automated. And so that's why my conclusion is that a lot more thought is needed into regulating this and not leaving it to contractual agreements alone, because there are all these unexpected situations. And regulation, I know, can be a bad word in the tech sector, but it is something that is needed for protection right now, and something that one way that you can actually build in is to build in reviews for the registration every few years to cope with, so the amendments can be made because of changes in the tech. But something needs to be done because the current situation where the big platforms are actually creating law is definitely not going to be of benefit to the individual person. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Really appreciate. And Ben, he's doing a lot of research, well connected with the government in Singapore and also the NTU, also with the international and UN community. I understand you've been speaking at the UN committees for cybersecurity. So, any question and burning points, Frank?
Yeah, Isa, sorry, we've been sort of glossing over this, and maybe I should have brought it out earlier. We've been using the terms fair use and fair dealing. And I just want to point out that fair use, really is a US concept only. It is a defense against infringement. In other words, it concedes that an infringement has taken place. There's no question the use is infringing. It's simply whether the factors that go into a fair use defense are applicable or not. Whereas fair dealing is typically an explicitly allowed act. It is not infringement. So I just want to make these points out. And again, the US litigation is largely falling on whether the infringement has in fact been fair. And I think when you take the criteria that's applicable for fair use, it's going to fail.
Thanks for that, Frank. I have a point. Look, I just finished my PhD at late in life because 20 years ago I guess my kid was born and I had to go out of Cambridge and sort of make my income and living. But I grew up in Singapore, and let me try and figure out how to put this in perspective. So I have, obviously I have a lot of background about Singapore. I have respect for the fact that, Singapore is well advanced, small country, right? But when I was signed to a major label at the age 17, I was then drafted immediately into the military service because Singapore has military service. So I think that sort of, there's a lot of restrictions on content in Singapore. Now, my question or concern is with regulations like POFMA. POFMA is a regulation that the government can basically take down any content from the internet. Will you guys or will Singaporeans be creating a background database for extreme bias, pro-government propaganda content in the music industry or in any industry, in any AI industry, because the extreme bias comes from government control of background database, which is, public internet. And if that is happening, then what's going to happen with AI? Does that make sense?
The question is about if the AIs are trained on a lot of, let's say, state control or state influenced media, then will the AI then generate a lot of content which is going to be leading towards? Yes, definitely that will happen.
I mean, let me put it another way. I don't want all the AI music to sound like we are Singapore. We are Singapore,
Definitely. So if you train, let's say, right, if your data set is all going to be, let's say you want to train your data set. I want Thai music, but you only take Thai disco.
Yeah.
And you only take like Sabai, right?
Right.
Then everything will sound like Sabai. But you have to train it on a wider field. Now, if you get a government-funded project that only trains on state-run media, then yes, I think definitely the answers that come back will come from that particular source. So the interest then is, if you want a wider set of sources, you need to have a wider set of inputs, which is not lacking.
Will they be picking and choosing what music goes into international, GAI databases that create music for the Singaporean community, for the Thai community, for the Chinese community? I know that China will definitely want to put their fingers into this new.
And the good news is that the models, the open source models, are widely available. So there is no, unlike in the days when you could stop magazines from coming in to any country. So you might not, let's say, an issue of Rolling Stone had something about, smoking cannabis, then wow, that gets banned in certain countries, right? Or songs, remember songs, you could actually ban songs on the radio.
I mean, what happens if they ban music that from people with long hair?
Yes, but that's no longer possible.
Okay.
And so that's no longer possible. The amount of inputs that everybody can get, and even POFMA itself, the law does not seek to ban. The law actually, the directions which are issued is that if this post, if the authorities disagree with this particular post, then the direction says that the social media company must put the authorities fact check next to it side by side. And basically they realize that if you want to take it down, once you take it down, it will appear somewhere else and become more popular. So what they want to do is put a fact check. And whether you believe the fact check or not, it's up to you. So I think my thing about adding in Asian sources of music is that we don't leave it to just one entity to do it. Everybody who has ability to train AI models can then choose your own source of Asian music. For example, there's a great experimental electronic scene in Thailand. And if you want that to be able to be represented, then train a model on that. And at the same time, also find a way to, adequately compensate the artists whom you're training it on. It doesn't have to be left to an authority, thankfully, because of the ability to open source. Frank's got a great model on, markets decides what it wants to hear. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Anybody else? Okay, cool. So Luke, tell us about China. What's happening? And how is your AI research going?
Hi, everyone. I'm Luke. Actually, I have a number of different of identities in my past career and experience. First, I've been introduce a bit about myself that I've been a CTO for a number of technical startups for the past 20 years in China. So one of these company goes to Nasdaq. Another one was successfully sold to Alibaba Group. So that's one of my identity that leads me to now doing a AI music research work in Auckland University of Technology. But besides that, I have two other identity. One is I'm a musician. I've been playing in a rock band 30 years ago. And I do my jazz recording in about 20 years ago. And so I'm really interested in a musician's perspective to speak a little bit about my experience with music AI tools. As a musician, even as early as back about 30 years ago when in 1998, I've been already starting using the some computer-assisted music production tools already. I done a TV commercial. I done the music. I create a music for a TV commercial for Ogilvy in 1998. At the time, it is very different comparing with the AI tools these days. Most of these tools are created on a rule-based software, and there's also many other examples that musicians are using tools to assist in their music compositions. For example, there's a lot of hardwares we are using. For example, the sequencers, the drum machines. We are for many electronic musicians, they are using arpeggiators, which was some sort of computer assistant in their music creations. So it's not a new phenomenon. Music AI. So as a musician, we do learn from other musicians a lot. We do analyze all their different pieces, musics. We analyze their chord progress. We analyze their melodies. We analyze the intervals of the two different notes. That's how we learn music. That's how I learned jazz when in 2000. And then in terms of and then we trying to create something that which is we're trying to create something which was not I mean never heard from other pieces, not similar to other pieces. Try to be more creative, but it's very hard. So in terms of the copyrights, I think I'm not representing all of the musicians, but it doesn't bother us once it's not your music is not the AI music did not generate music pieces that is very similar to yours, And I think that would be a situation that that's totally fine. And I think we also we also think things about when we are using AI tools, how to avoid the copyright issues that we are stepping into. And that's the two things when we are using these AI tools. So my current work at the Auckland University of Technology is I have just released a paper on a piano and on a music generation model, which was generating a about 5 to 6 minute a normal length of long and consistency music pieces, which is with all the performance details. And so I heard that there's opinions about whether the music we generated is the AI generated is different comparing with the human generating ones. My opinions, we don't know. We don't know if they are different or not. Sorry. Can you still hear me?
Carry on. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yes. We don't know. We have nothing. We know nothing about how our human brain works. So we cannot make an assumption that the AI is not working exactly the same way as human beings are. That's some area that we cannot make a conclusion for that. It's unknown. But in terms of the quality, we can see generative AI is generating contents really very similar to human creativities, very similar. And yes, that's basically my my points about my points from a perspective from a musician and as well as a technology.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Luke. Really appreciate everybody here being here today. And I think I just want to open the conversation up to pretty much anybody in the house, questions, points.
Maybe I'll pitch in again. Luke, thanks. I think it's good to hear you talking about the positive side of this. I mean, I'm finding AI amazing in the way that it is like a co-creator, that it stimulates ideas. I work with it. I've been amazed recently too at some friends who are saying how they're enjoying their jobs more now that they're using AI a lot. One the other day, Chinese Singaporean in middle management, and he's just said, he uses ChatGPT in all kinds of ways, as to sort of stimulate different ideas, to do grunt work, to get him past, blockages, etc. I've been developing a lot of software recently, and I find it's much more enjoyable with ChatGPT. You don't get stuck sometimes. You know, it helps to explain some code. It'll write the boring code. It lets me do more of the interesting, fun stuff. So, you know, I think it's important to talk about these aspects too. You know, the positive aspect of how this can actually make our lives better in many ways. I'm seeing that, and I'm speaking to people who are seeing that.
Well, I just have to say one thing. As Howie mentioned, I teach data analysis in the music industry at NYU, and most of the work that my students have to do is in spreadsheets, you know, data calculations and data analysis. And 3 times this semester, my students have used ChatGPT to generate their calculations for their homework on spreadsheets. Guess how many times ChatGPT hallucinated and gave incorrect results? Someone guess.
All 3 times.
A lot.
So out of 3, how many?
3 times.
Correct. All 3 were obvious. I mean, I didn't have to look at it for more than 5 seconds to understand that it was wrong. It wasn't deep and subtle. It was just clearly wrong.
Well, to your point, I think there's been cases of lawyers putting in briefs that have been generated by ChatGPT and citing cases that never existed.
Absolutely right.
You know, somebody can create little language bombs out there and create imaginary things, you know, for AI systems to pick up. I mean, you know, propagandist governments, you know, lobbyists, such as, you know, strong groups that are out there. I don't know, but seriously, is it possible to create a biased song? I mean, yes, we can create biased AI, biased ChatGPT, but can we create biased music?
Well, I really appreciated Ben's comments about the global South being cut out from the developments in the conversation. You know, I really appreciated hearing that. You know, here in the US, we get our US view. And one of the things that we get here is that, you know, the music scene in India, for example, is really heating up. And we're getting all this stuff about local scenes being invigorated by local artists. But what does that really mean in the grand scheme of things is something that I don't think we understand.
I'll just say on the hallucinations, yeah, I mean, you have to be absolutely on your guard all the time. One of the surprises for me when I started using AI, ChatGPT, I mean, I used it a bit earlier, but mainly a couple of years ago with ChatGPT, was that I noticed it was much more interesting as a co-creative tool than as a factual tool. I mean, it's terrible on facts. You just have to check everything. I found that it's got much better. I now use ChatGPT 4.0. Compared to the free version. Bill, your students, were they using the free version maybe? Or
yes.
Yeah, there's a significant difference. It's actually better. But the other day, at the same time, it still goes crazy. The other day, I asked it to do some maths for me, but I needed some functions in some music software I'm developing, and it just gave me stuff that was just nonsense. I mean,
you get what you pay for.
Yeah, I think it's a tool as well, you know, because I use it a lot for lots of different applications I'm working on. And you can use it as a grunt tool. You know, it can take out 80% of the work, but it doesn't nuance and it doesn't, and you have to fact check and go to curation before you can say something's finished. And that's where, you know, let's say you're a lawyer or something, that's where the big risk is. It's not for those experienced lawyers who know the art of winning a case, the art of triaging data. It's the junior lawyers who are just, you know, hacks putting the data together. They're the ones at risk because that's what AI is doing very well currently.
I like Tim's example if we apply it to music, right? Because we've got even in this room here, right? We've got people expressing different parts of the music spectrum. We've got some of us are at the label level, at the commercial, successful, you know, this is actually a work, it's a career option that is successful career option. Then at the other end, there's the casual home user who is saying, this is just using AI for music self-expression, which this music may never see the light of day, may never be published, may never be monetized. In between, there are those who might aspire to having a career in music. Or those who are actually having a career in music right now, but have some elements of it which may be automatable. And really, there is a whole form, there are many kinds of music that are being created now, which background, library, which could very quickly become automatable because the listener is not looking out for the full aesthetic value. Actually, if you want to talk about it, a huge chunk of popular music may be actually replaceable because the audience actually doesn't really care about the quality. They just want something they can sing along with, right? If you just listen to any average top 10, the musical quality is not the thing that's selling the most. So, but that whole spectrum, AI has different benefits and different risks for all involved.
That's a really good point. I don't think I would, care if I had really attractive music in the elevator when I walk into a hotel. I'm not sure about you guys, but hotel music is hotel music. Elevator music is elevator music. If you can generate it, I don't care. It's like, okay, wonderful, right? But I do see your point about the different segments of the music industry, and they're all representing different parts of the economic scale.
Well, we've talked about production music, which is, you could think of it as akin to elevator music in a way. It's the background music for a podcast or something like that. But one thing that I have learned recently in some work that I've done is that a category that tends to get ignored in these kinds of discussions, but that is enormous, is ambient sort of music for studying, ambient noise and sleep kind of thing, which is extremely lucrative because people play it on repeat, and it generates royalties for hours and hours. Absolutely. And this is such a huge thing. And it's easy to generate with AI. And there was someone in the US recently who was indicted for fraud for using AI to generate these kinds of tracks with fake artists and fake metadata, and amassed allegedly $10 million in royalties from doing this and misrepresenting himself.
I remember
this was just it was filed maybe 6 weeks ago or something like that. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. You don't need AI to do this, but AI surely helps scale up that kind of activity. But the other thing I wanted to say is that my sister-in-law is a freelance writer. I should say was a freelance writer. A lot of the work that she had gotten has been taken over by AI. And it's things like the newsletter that you get with your monthly electric bill. That's not a very high priority on creativity. And that stuff is all going to ChatGPT and the like now. And I think we can expect to see analogous developments in music. I think that's pretty clear that that's going to happen.
I don't think there's any way to stop that, but there is a risk associated with these, let's call them lower quality output, right? Less creative, less
functional music. Lucian Grange calls it functional music.
Functional music, that was the word I used on my slide. But this isn't only here. If you can replace most of the writer's room at a TV show with those kinds of writers, if you could replace the people who learn how to write high school sports stories in a local newspaper with those people, if you replace the paralegals at a law firm who read briefs and analyze the facts that then become part of what a lawyer like Frank might put in, you are removing the apprenticeship in many of these fields that gives people the training. Let's remember, Barry Manilow wrote jingles before he wrote songs, right? And, this has been a path all along that people learn their craft the infamous 10,000 hours, right? By doing things that are not necessarily the most lucrative settings. And yes, AI is going to replace those first. And one of the fears, it was one of the reasons why the writers and the actors in Hollywood went on strike over AI issues, is that these jobs would go away. And it isn't so much that they couldn't be done by machines, it's that they were taking away the opportunity for people to learn the craft so that ultimately they could do the creative work of creating the new TV show, and being a showrunner. And they didn't get the chance to climb that ladder of success. And we have that with, students doing functional music, doing production music, doing jingles, writing for the energy, the power company for their newsletter, so that ultimately they could maybe write, a better nonfiction book or whatever. So I don't think there's any way to stop it, but I think there is a risk with it that we're going to have to figure out how do we train people if those jobs are all being done by AI.
Totally agree with you. Great point.
I just want to raise something that Bill just brought up, that dude with the FTC case. That really was fascinating as well. My understanding, though, was that the fraud part of it was that he created tens of thousands of bots who simply asked Spotify that this is what we want to hear. And it sort of perverted the pie so that a larger slice of that went to him and didn't go to anybody else. And that's something we really didn't get into, is what happens when AI starts. Okay, so what happens when AI starts deciding what goes on our playlist and what gets out there to be chosen or not? What happens when we're force-fed a lot of We Are Singapore music?
Yes.
So again, we didn't really gloss onto that. And for me, I guess think a lot of the moral stuff as well, where it comes down to, and that's what Ben was getting at a little bit. I think it's on the one hand, you've got Randy Travis, who is using it in what I think none of us would object to as a completely genius creation. Fantastic. Good for him. I juxtapose that, though, against, Peter Jackson, whose work I love, recreating the Beatles conversations that they may have wanted to suppress behind their music. I know when I was watching the World Series, for example, these dudes would go out and the pitcher would talk to the catcher. They have to hold their mitts up so that nobody can hear what they're saying or otherwise recreate it. There is a part of which, people's right to be left alone or to decide for themselves, excuse me, what they want out there versus what the consumer simply wants has to come into the discussion.
Frank, can I just add on to that? Just a quick one before Ben comes in. Just now, someone mentioned, I think Howie mentioned that AI systems are deciding what artists we should be listening to. That's exactly the worry, right? So what artists, we should be listening to on these various streaming services. And what data do they have to make that decision? I am concerned about this. Why are they pushing this stuff to me? So Ben?
Was I coming in on this? I didn't realize.
Yeah. I don't know. You were saying something. Yeah,
no.
Yeah, I could continue. I mean, look, I don't like the thinking, the thought that systems are deciding what I should and should not do. There's so much bias in this thing, right? There's so much bias in say LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn, LinkedIn jobs and stuff.
He says, stop shopping on Amazon, stop using Netflix, stop using Spotify. Stop reading the New York Times on your phone. Every one of those is pushing information to you based on your patterns of consumption in the past. You might not like what they're giving you, but by the way, if you skip the next 3 songs that Spotify recommended, they'll improve what they're recommending to you. You can steer clear of that, but you may have to go back to using a Nokia phone with no screen on it.
You want to really mess up your algorithm, you let your 9-year-old go and play your Spotify. Then see what happens to your year-end wrapped after that.
I get this.
The release radar is completely 9-year-old songs.
Pull the records out.
I get these messages about hearing aids and several old man messages. I think they're wrong. I'm not that old. I'm not deaf. So it's like, guys, come on, please don't send me these messages anymore.
But the techniques that push these things to you They weren't called AI until relatively recently. They weren't given the brand name.
That's right. That's right.
They were called other stuff. It's what's AI? It's a marketing term, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Lisa, you got a good point, right? Because right now, I think my 9-year-old is being self-radicalized by Spotify to listen to this particular genre of music, which is related to this particular game, Friday Night Funkin', which is one of those like you rhythm games. It's like Band Hero, but the music is everything is in 16th notes and 32nd notes, right? Semiquavers and demi-semiquavers, and it's all non-verbal vocal samples. It's like scat, but on meth.
Yeah. So
it's because the more he listens,
your
the
kid
more
gets
it's
good music, right?
Huh?
The dude in Bangladesh, he gets Merry Christmas songs every day.
So now he's like gone into
That's
this
great.
because every time he listens,
I'm sure a lot of people in
he listens
Bangladesh
more.
are interested in that.
So yeah, I get that. Yeah. Okay. So he gets 16 notes, songs with 16 notes.
I mean, is the basically the highly annoying high-pitched vocal sample. They go right? Very high. And the more you listen, the more you get. Then you start getting in, it starts recommending meme songs. And then I have to start filtering because a lot of the meme songs then come up with, you end up with certain extreme content now in meme songs.
What's that genre called, Ben? I really have to check it out. It sounds bizarre and interesting.
FNF.
It's really out of
Friday
it.
Night Funkin'. Look for
Anybody
that.
care to name the most popular music video in history on YouTube?
Isn't it Baby Shark?
Baby Shark. Gotta be.
It passed Despacito 2 years ago and hasn't looked back.
Wow. Well, what's that going to do with AI systems? I hope that they don't interject Baby Shark in every other song that they recommend me.
Well, Isa, your question about, right, when let's say vulnerable young persons are listening to music and then they start being recommended stuff which goes down a particular chain and there are because Spotify not only and the different platforms not only produce music, they also produce podcasts. So now you then get into something where the music is popular within, let's say, far-right groups, QAnon conspiracy theorist groups. And then now a vulnerable young person who was actually interested in video game music gets sucked into a QAnon conspiracy group because the music they like is also featured in a podcast which is run by a conspiracy group. It is actually happening. And my number 2 son actually stopped my number 4 son from getting into a particular far-right Minecraft build, which he had almost stumbled into.
Well, you've just explained why Australia is banning social media for kids under 16.
That's right. That's happening right now.
Right. Howie, I think I'm sorry to interrupt. Howie, I think your point is a really good one, though. I mean, the most popular, does that mean it's the best? Pizza is probably the most popular food in the world, but does that really mean it's the best food in the world? I don't even know what point I'm trying to make, but you're right. Popular is largely just what we're often exposed to or what we're fed, so to speak. I don't know whether or not that means it's good. I don't even know what point I'm trying to make, but popular isn't necessarily the way word. But you're absolutely right. Baby Shark's the most popular video. God help us.
We have this dichotomy in the internet era, right? I mean, everybody said the democratization of access and the ability to put any song up on Spotify, and this will be great. And the demand will shift from the head of the curve to the long tail. This was the long tail theory, that the revenues will shift towards the niche artists. And what is certainly true is that if I'm interested in ambient music or I'm interested in reggaeton from Puerto Rico, I can find a playlist about that stuff, but the demand really hasn't shifted very much towards the tail. The biggest artists are still the biggest artists. The biggest movies are still the biggest movies.
It's
The
the
Harry
opposite.
Potter books still made more money for J.K. Rowling than any other author in the world. And
Yeah.
we're a blockbuster culture still.
You know, what's interesting is
is Baby Shark an anomaly? Can I ask?
What about Baby Shark?
Is it an anomaly? It's not a major label. It's not a major label.
It's not an anomaly. Every one of the top 10 videos on YouTube is a music video. 6 out of the 10 are what we'd consider major artist videos. So Gangnam Style, Despacito, Ed Sheeran, Shape of You. But there's a couple from Coco Melon, and there's, Baby Shark. And part of the reason for that is, less so for videos, but certainly true for Spotify. When you create a service that can be controlled by voice, you give access to music to kids. And, why we don't talk about Bruno, the most played song on Spotify the first half of the year 2 years ago? It was because of Disney and the movie. And kids could ask for it. And if any of you have kids, or in my case, grandkids, you know how often they can repeat the same thing over and over and over again. Right. And that drives that demand. Kids have access to what they never did before.
Bill, carry on, Bill. Let's go.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a little factoid about the long tail, since we brought it up. I was actually explaining this to my daughter the other day over Thanksgiving. And I was showing that Chris Anderson, who is now the head of the TED organization, created that whole concept of the long tail and wrote a whole book about it. That concept has been 100% discredited. And if you look at his Wikipedia entry, it makes no mention of that whatsoever. No mention of the book, no mention of the concept. He has expunged that from his record on Wikipedia.
Really? But why? Because there is
because he failed.
Hits, right?
So Howie explained what the long tail theory was, and the idea was that instead of going to a record store, you could get all the music that you want. There's infinite inventory in the world of the internet. It's not just what does your record store have? What does your HMV or whatever your record store is? Or in the US, it's Tower Records, whatever or if it's bookstores, it's Barnes and Noble in the US, whatever it might be. But so that's going to lift the tide of opportunity for everybody, for the niche creators. What he failed to take into consideration, Economics 101, is that the purchasing power of the public doesn't change. People still have the same fixed amount of money to spend on content, and they're not going to. And so the fractional amount that they will end up collectively, as all people with spending money can spend, ends up being infinitesimally small for those niche artists, and it creates opportunities for gaming the system, which is something that Howie studies in great depth. How to game the system, so that the well-financed big stars can get even more further up the chain. And so you've got this. You'll have to follow my hand because I don't have something to draw on. But it went from a curve like this to a curve more like this, what's called an inverse power law curve. And so and then you get into this situation. Well, how come Spotify pays such terrible, piddling royalties? It's because of the amount of content that's available there, and the fact that the amount of money that people spend on music only grows very incrementally over time with the number of hours in the day that people listen to music. It does not grow geometrically with the amount of music that is put up onto the services. So as Howie likes to say, the math doesn't math. and that's why you get where you are, and that's why people, can't make a living as musicians, because, or at least not through streaming. They might make a living playing live or being teachers or whatever, but not that way.
Or selling pictures of their feet on OnlyFans, that is a true story. Lily Allen said she gets more money on OnlyFans than she makes with her music now.
I know, I read about
And that's a really sad statement.
It is a sad statement.
Okay, hey, listen, guys, can we see if anybody else out there has a question or a point? Anybody else? I see Ryan out there. I see WHLBL. I don't know who these people are. Anybody else? Okay, if there's none, I will have one for you guys. So, so we have a significant amount of lawyers in the room today, and I just want to say, look, creativity is not just about a law. I think it has to do also with sharing content, because actually copyright law was formed and it was set up to be able to provide incentives to individuals, but it was also set up to provide incentive to individuals for a limited time. Why? Because it was recognized at the time that you can, at some point or other, that should go to the public space, and there's a concept of a public space. So why is that public space not recognized in this AI dimension? And why is it always a lawyer problem? I'm a technology guy. Why is it the lawyers always come after us, right? Can you guys, just chill out and just let us do our thing?
You want to share by taking my stuff without asking me or questioning me?
Let's go around the room.
How about you come in and share pictures of your wife in the bedroom, because it'll make everything better. Just train systems. I mean, come on. He said, people can do with music what music creators want them to do. It's not your right as a consumer to take it and twist it around and make it backwards and come out in 5 different languages simply because you want to. You're allowed to enjoy the music. That's why it's put out there. But I'm sorry, you can't just take it and then call it sharing by twisting it and breaking it down and making it something that the creator never intended it to be.
Okay, Bill, is this a lawyer problem?
Well, so let me offer this. I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV. I recommend, some of you may be familiar with Lawrence Lessig, and some of you may have feelings about him one way or another.
I've met him.
but I have not, but I have actually worked with some of his students. So in his first book, which is called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, he had this concept, which I think is absolutely brilliant. It's been called, not by him, but by others, the pathetic dot theory. And it says that there are 4 forces that control whatever environment you want to analyze. And I may be paraphrasing here, I may not get it exactly right, but they are essentially technology, the market, laws, and behaviors, human behaviors. And so if you look at, and he was looking at the internet back when, in its early days when he wrote that book, and he had his conclusions that he drew, but the framework for looking at that is, to me, very powerful. And the slide that I showed that said the multi-front war and all that sort of thing, that's very much related and influenced by Lessig's 4 forces or pathetic dot theory. So law is one of those forces. And it's one of the weapons that you wield, to extend the war analogy, in trying to get things to be the way you want them to be. And it's not the only one. So we found out that influencing the public is much easier to do in the internet age than it was before. And there was another brilliant piece of work that I'll point you to by a guy named Bill Herman, who now teaches at Hunter College here in New York City. He wrote a PhD thesis that looked at the influence of 3 types of discourse on digital copyright legislation. Discourse inside what we call inside the Beltway, meaning within the Washington, D.C. sphere, and lobbying groups and so forth. That's number 1. Number 2 was the press, the mainstream media. So here in the U.S., New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Newsweek and Time and whatever else. And then the third sphere was the public, the general public. And he analyzed in a empirical, rigorous way, in my opinion, how the increase in influence that the public sphere had because of the internet caused digital copyright legislation to tilt a certain way over time. And so those of you who are familiar with US law will possibly remember the SOPA PIPA ACTA era in the early 2010s. He wrote his thesis and published a book based on it called The Digital Copyright Wars or something like this, just a year or two before all those legislations died an ignominious death from pressure brought to bear by the public, arguably through the influence of companies like Google, who kind of seeded the dialogue. He presaged the death of those bills in his thesis by this work. So, to answer your question, I'm sorry, that's a very long-winded answer, so I apologize. But law is one ingredient, and it's one that we're looking at now, in addition to looking at the technology developments that are happening. Law takes a while to affect what's going on. Behaviors are ever evolving, and the market is ever evolving.
I'd like to add, this is no different than what's come before. Ultimately, it will get decided either in a courtroom or a conference room. It would be better if it was decided in a conference room. But to have a meeting in a conference room, you need people on both sides of the table interested in making a deal. And as long as the tech companies think they can take without permission, and they will win in court when they say it's fair use and it's people training like people learn, as long as they believe they don't have to pay, they won't pay, right? I mean, that's simple economics. It makes their goods more profitable if they don't have to pay for the raw materials. If McDonald's didn't have to pay for hamburger meat, they'd make more money, and I say that not to malign music or chopped meat, but, it's just a statement of economic fact. And I've said the worst thing that can happen right now in the industry is that all the cases go the way of the tech companies. What that led to in the first phases of Napster was the recording industry suing individuals and catching grandmothers and teenagers because the court said they couldn't sue successfully the software developers. That changed over time. And then people came to the table and deals got made and Spotify got its free tier. But it took time to do that. If all the cases go the tech company's way, there's nobody that's going to be sitting at the conference table agreeing on the money. I'd also go the other way, though. If the content owners win every suit, they'll become convinced that they can control this genie that's out of the bottle, and that won't be a good outcome either. I think we need some cases to go each way so that both groups, following one of the tried and true strategies of game theory, minimize their maximum risk, the mini-max theory. And the maximum risk is they lose everything. So to minimize that maximum risk, they come to the table, they make a deal, and people get paid, and the tech companies have to pay for their raw materials to some degree. That's the best outcome. But if the court cases go the wrong way, and they're going to, go through appeals and maybe to the Supreme Court someday, and maybe the courts in Singapore will decide something different, and Europe certainly will. But the only solution that works is one that's done in a conference room. But to get there, you got to get people interested in sitting down to make a deal. I'm off my soapbox now.
Well, another little piece of anecdata that I will say is, the law, courts can make decisions, and then the public can thumb its nose at those decisions. Look at what just happened a month ago here in the United States. We elected a president who's been convicted of felonies. The majority of the public decided that they don't care that the guy's a convicted felon, that he's been judged by a court to be in violation of some laws. So that's another, there are these different factors that influence one another.
Yeah. And I mean, that presumes everybody is a right-minded, well-thoughtful person like us. You guys are bringing up some really excellent points, talking about SOPA and PIPA before. And yeah, we were riding on the crest of that at the MPAA. Everybody went home on a Friday night in the US thinking it was in the bag. It was dead by Monday, largely because a lot of called it influence by Google. I'd say disinformation. The fact is there's 41 countries, more than 40 countries around the world that have site blocking legislation. And guess what? The internet isn't broken. It works just fine. I was largely responsible for getting the law in place in Singapore. What was put out there over by the tech companies who had a vested interest in this not happening simply wasn't true. And, a lot of went on the election. Geez, if everybody had thought properly about it, I would like to think there would have been a different outcome. But there's all sorts of allegations about information that was put out there by people who wanted the election to go a certain way. It isn't that people wake up and are thoughtful and consider it like we have been for the last 2.5 hours, 2 3/4 hours. And that's unfortunate.
Ben, any thoughts?
Frank, I really like what Frank is saying, right? And also Bill and Howie, because the whole point of there being multiple forces that actually come into play to actually create what is, at the end of the day, the policy that affects all our lives. Music and AI is just one section of the whole tech regulation and AI regulation question. And what we are seeing here is a microcosm of what is been really in play for decades now, ever since the whole idea of John Perry Barlow's manifesto for the free internet has been actually co-opted by tech companies that are actually larger than a huge number of the United Nations
misquoted by them.
Yes, because they are talking. He was talking about an internet that was not control content with content recommending algorithms, whereas the tech companies now have content recommending algorithms that are far from the free internet that was envisaged when we were on bulletin boards. So the whole idea of this, all the ideologies of pseudo-libertarianism, which is now basically don't regulate us, we'll do whatever we like, and that's in the best interest of humankind, is all basically there to drive the economic benefit of huge billion-dollar corporations at the expense of the average person, especially in the global south, where the relationship, the power dynamic between the citizens and the tech companies is way, way less. So since the information flow is controlled by the algorithms that are put out by the tech companies, they're able to create that whole mindset, influencing, as you say, the population, to then have that feeling, oh yeah, okay, maybe we'll just let AI do whatever and it'll be all okay in the end. But not realizing that there are a lot of, it is not an open playing field, it's not a fair level playing field. There are huge giant corporations that are moving the direction of where things are happening in the interest of profit rather than the interest of society. And so as a society, then we need to help everybody be more informed, that Frank's point, right? If more people be informed and be able to think about this in a way apart from all the stuff we've been fed, because all our feeds are fed with, move fast and break things kind of thinking. And fortunately, now there is more alternative voices that are coming up and saying, no, actually, we do need to think of protecting the individual creator, in our case, the music, protecting the individual musician for the future of our art and for the future of society and how society benefits from music by people. And so, of course, this has been a fantastic 3 hours. We are not going to reach a solution today, but it's a time that we need to start educating people to have a better discussion on this rather than just blindly taking what is available through the big platforms.
Thanks, Ben. I'm just going to throw something into the spanner, a spanner in the works right now. So a lot was said about fair use. And I agree that the definition is a little bit dodgy. It's a little bit difficult. Coming from an academic background, I can see the validity and the genuine sort of use and in that space. And I also agree, Ben and everybody else, that there's a whole different bunch of people that are playing in this field, right? There's the musicians, there's the poor musicians, there's the artists, there's the one that's signed. They all belong in different groups. But I do think that on the AI space, there might be a kind of in technical terms, a legitimate use to this, right? You remember in those days there were some lawsuits about the potential for legitimate users for new technologies. This might be it. And can we consider this as one of the potential legitimate users that new technology wants to break away with all standards? Mind you guys, right? We're all musicians. There's a lot of musicians here in this webinar. We know that music is copied every time, all the time. Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven was copied 10 times. I think Led Zeppelin copied it with somebody else. There's like a documentary about this, and those guys made a lot of money from that song. I know, Frank, you will, disagree with me, but the Indian raga is based on one tune that everybody plays. Why? Because they don't care about the so-called copyright about their raga. They want to go out there and make different versions of that, and they are totally okay.
Well, ragas are musical forms that are kind of equivalent to, they're roughly analogous to scales in Western music, and combination of scale and rhythmic pattern. And you can't copyright stuff like that in the US. If there was a case, for example, that I was involved with. It's one of these, you ripped off my song kind of cases, like the Stairway to Heaven case was one of those. But this was a Katy Perry case where the ultimate outcome was, well, all you found that Katy Perry and her co-songwriters copied was 4 notes of a scale, and you can't copyright 4 notes of a scale. That's not protectable expression. So there was a jury verdict of infringement, which was thrown out by the judge, who agreed that this was not protectable expression. So, I mean, well, the other thing about ragas is that they're very, very old. I spent a little bit of time studying this a while back in my life. Not that I'm an expert, but I know a tiny bit about it. How could anyone know everything about South Asian music? It's the rich, huge tradition, but I know a tiny bit about it. And I know enough to know that it's, copyrights have time limitations, term limitations, and ragas are many, many times the age of anything that's copyrightable.
Yeah.
I have to say, man, I think what you said there about ragas, the idea that it's one tune, I think that's way off. Ragas are like scales. I've studied Indian music quite a bit, and including instruments, some singing and things. Ragas are like scales, but even more interesting than that, there are a set of rules for each of the ragas about how you ornament the different degrees of the scales. So in a way, it's like in jazz, in a certain genre of jazz, you're playing on a certain scale at a certain time, but there are also genre rules, if you like, about what you do within that, how you improvise within that. And Indian musicians, the great skill is being able to do improvisation while adhering to these rules of the scale and the ornamentation of each degree of the scale. It's an amazingly rich, deep system with, I always think of it as being as deep as Western classical music, but along completely different dimensions from Western classical music. But it's not one tune or anything like that.
It's more like a scale on steroids. It's to call it a scale is a trivialization of what a raga is structurally.
Well, I would say it's partly a scale. I mean, each raga has a scale. In fact, there's a name in my mind now for the scale, meaning the set of pitches. But then what it is a set of rules of how what kind of pitch bends you do on each of those degrees within that raga. And if you're not doing the right pitch bends on the right degrees, you're not following the raga and you're not respected.
Yeah.
At least that's my.
I got a question.
Expert, of course.
Johnny.
Interpolation. At what point do we decipher if it was accidentally so similar, or if anybody had no ill intent to replay a melody? One model I'm working on with our company is an interpolation model to detect something like that. That's something I noticed. It's hard to decipher. Like if I played a piano melody in key, and it just so happened to be the same as Beethoven. Obviously, that's past copyrights. But an example, how do we decipher that? I know emerging technologies will help with that in AI, but when it comes to litigation, I'm sure there's some people on the call here that could kind of help explain that when it comes to that. But I do know that comes
Explain
in
what?
interpolation.
When you get in trouble, how much of the song can you take before you get in trouble? That's what he's asking.
Yeah. Yeah. Because like in the music industry in the States, we have a big problem with interpolation in from hip hop and samples and then EDM. Some of these EDM artists are just making their own samples and they might sound almost 99% accurate to a famous one that's already out there. But when it comes to like how do you argue that in law? Obviously the one that's already out there and that's generating revenue would have more backing. And it's just an interesting subject I would like to talk about.
Johnny, sorry, can you explain what you mean by interpolation? Because that word means something different to me, I think.
Isa
Me too.
explained it. Isa explained it pretty easy.
Yeah, I think how much of the song you're taking in your samples in
Yeah,
your
it's really the law treats it as a very situation specific thing. So, for example, I think Frank mentioned the Alone Again Naturally case with Biz Markie. So that went one way, but then Two Live Crew and Pretty Woman went the other way. You know, there have been a lot of it's very situation specific. It's judge specific. You know, George Harrison was sued for She's So Fine. You know, He's So Fine. What was that? The Chiffons or whatever it was.
Mhm.
For My
The
Sweet Lord.
The Robin Thicke incident too is pretty interesting. That was a good case of that as well.
Blurred Lines. Yeah, that's
And
right.
Pharrell blurred lines. It's just very interesting because it's such a like obviously it's case by case and the who some of it is malicious, some of it's not. In music industry now we see with these TikTok trending songs, a lot of these 60s, 70s, and 80s songs are going reviral. Like the guy drinking the juice box, I can't remember Fleetwood Mac. You know, that was a
Yeah.
good example. It's just interesting to
Dogface. Yeah.
yeah, Dogface, yeah.
I understand that some of the
Yeah.
labels are actually, those with big catalogs are actually now marketing. The publishers are marketing the songs for interpolation purposes.
Absolutely.
So that
100%.
as a new songwriter, or if you need to hit for a new artist, you can make use of one phrase from a popular song from the 80s or 90s, which has some cachet, and then take that phrase and you can now license the interpolation of it. Just drop that phrase in, and then you build an entire different song around it. But because you got that catchy part, you have the chance of having chart success. And that seems to be contractually creating a whole different area now, that because there's an underlying potential to be sued. I think the Beyonce's use of the interpolation of Kelly's Milkshake brought this to the public attention, but it's been happening a lot, right? So now that you have a potential of being sued or potential of being cancelled, which is worse than being sued sometimes, then you now have the ability to create this whole area of monetization based on phrases or melody snippets that benefits certain people, but also then creates a big question mark on what is should be allowed. What do we as a society think is good or not good for?
Well, it's not up to society, man. That's a great point. And I think creators do want to monetize their work. Issa asked the question about, when does copyright get out of the way? People don't get copyright protection so that they can suppress their works necessarily. They want to make money off of it, which is why, to Howie's earlier point, digital sampling became a phenomenon. They came to the conference table after there was some litigation. DVDs were the best thing that ever happened to the movie industry for a while. So, it is at the end of the day all about creators making money for stuff that they create. And I think that, it really doesn't have to get any more complicated than that.
Guys, it's coming to 4 o'clock here in New Zealand. So I'm going to sort of summarize the issues. And is there anything else that is, that anybody else wants to sort of highlight at this point?
I real quick to bring up in the States about last week, we got proposed a bill called the Train Act. I don't know if anybody's been familiar with what's going on with that. Very interesting. Basically, it's if I feel that you used my music in a data set, I can subpoena you. It's just a very being in the States and in tech and in music, these acts like the No Fakes Act. There's a new one coming up every week, and another senator just proposed one. I would love to quick talk about that. If not, we can move on as well.
I think it's a step in the right direction, but I think it's like telling you that you have a right to go chase your tail. I'm not sure what it really accomplishes. It's like subpoenaing IKEA to get a better understanding of what their fictional instruction sheet on how to build a cabinet is.
Well,
it's
essentially
support of all the rights owners groups, and there's no doubt it's a step in the right direction, but I'm not really sure it's where it gets us.
Well, let me explain to you what I think this could accomplish. So if to get the information that this bill envisions making it easier to get, you'd have to sue someone, you'd have to get a judge to allow discovery, you'd have to hire lawyers, you have to pay them tons of money, and your months and tens, hundreds of thousands down the line, and you get that information. This kind of moves the getting of that information up the chain so that it's faster and easier to get. Whether that information even exists in any comprehensible form is a whole nother question. And I'd say that the odds of that happening are not so great necessarily.
Well, I just think it's interesting because, like you said, the everyday user that would go after something like that, the dollar amount isn't worth it. You didn't generate much money, and then you got to pay $5,000 in lawyer fees and forensic fees. The cool thing, on the other hand, is people like us that are more focused on IP protection, where there's technologies now that are going to speed up that litigation and show you more accurate percent of vice versa of what's going on. So it's a very interesting time right now.
Indeed.
Yep.
Okay, guys, listen. Somebody mentioned Lawrence Lessig earlier. I think he's a person of stature. I mean, he came up with many interesting concepts about the self-regulatory environment of the internet, of technology. I think what we want is to have an architecture or a spine that affects good policy for every segment, not just one segment, two segment, or like the big business owners. And this is a problem, right? To try and regulate a situation where we regulate the technologies that's fair and just. And the issue is really just, right? What is justice? Justice here is about being able to allow many people to create good music and allow them to be protected from the music that they create. So I want to end this session by saying I'm really proud to have you guys as friends, and really privileged to have this session because music is always in my heart. I just finished my fellowship. I started working in a sort of consultancy, but this is a really important issue, and I hope that this session will be useful to everybody else. I'm going to post it somewhere, and I urge all you guys to get in touch with each other and sort of address some of these issues and questions along the line, and maybe make friends and do other projects together. Frank, do you have anything to add?
Just to say thank you, Isa. I agree with everything you said. It was great, and I really hope everybody benefited from it, and I hope you do make it available.
Okay. Anything else from anybody else?
Yeah, just thanks, Isa, again. Also, great. This is sort of left field for me. It's different from what I'm looking at mostly. I don't follow the legal stuff in the music industry. Everything I'm doing is non-commercial these days, but this has been fascinating. Thank you.
It's funny, we have so many techies and musicians, techies who are musicians who have joined us today. That's good. Somebody else is saying something?
Yeah, very informative, guys. There's a lot of these that don't really happen on the high level of security, copyrights, and music and AI in general. So it was very informative to hear a lot of echoes back of things we've been talking about, and the fact that all across the world there are prominent things that are discussed. So you guys, I'm going to be following you guys a lot more, and really excited at this. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Johnny.
Thank you all. Thanks to everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pete.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it. Have a great day wherever you are.
Guys, have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.